Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And you may notice on our screen today two wonderful, amazing guests that I don't even think need an introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. We have Michelle Stone of 132 Problems. How are you, Michelle?
I'm good. Thank you so much for hosting this. I'm really excited.
Yeah, it's going to be great. We have podcasted with Michelle before, and I'm going to link that in the show notes because that was an excellent podcast where we got to know Michelle a little bit more. We also have the wonderful Bill Reel. How are you today, Bill?
I'm doing exceptional and glad to be on the program today.
Yeah, this is something that's had a lot of moving parts and we've been working on for a while to try to get put together. But I think this is going to be informative and interesting, entertaining, scholarly. How many other adjectives can I use, Landon? What do you think?
Yeah, this is going to be great. We know both Bill and Michelle. We've got to meet them at several different post-Mormon things for Bill, and Michelle, we got to have lunch with her. Great people. We really enjoyed both these guests, and we think this is going to be a great discussion.
Yeah, it's going to be good. So the topic today, as you probably know from our thumbnail, I'm just going to say it extremely generally. We are going to be talking about land deeds. We are going to be talking about Joseph Smith giving land deeds to individuals in Nauvoo. That's all I'll say about it because I'm not going to say any more. But before we start, we were talking a little bit just in the pre-show kind of about how both Michelle and Bill would like to approach this as far as having different takes on this situation, different sides of this scenario. So maybe you guys could talk a little bit about that. After that point, we're going to go into a section where Bill's going to start, and he is going to give a 15-minute presentation to present sort of his information on this topic. Then Michelle will give a 15-minute presentation on her point of view on this topic, and then we'll do a little more discussion and back and forth. But we figure that's important to do because not everybody knows much about this topic, and it's really important and it's really interesting. So if you, Michelle and Bill, want to talk a little bit about what we talked about at the top of the show, just your hope and goal for this discussion and how you want to approach it, we'll do that. And then we'll go into Bill's 15-minute presentation.
Awesome. Michelle, grateful to be on with you. Do you want to start us off sharing sort of how you came to this?
Yes. Well, I think that would be great. So I do want to say, I know that Bill and I have disagreed on this topic, but I'm really glad that Bill made this deeds argument because it made me do a lot of research, a lot of work. I talk about this in my responses to him, that I feel like I learned a ton, and I really value that. I loved engaging with people who I disagree with because I feel like it makes us all sharper. And so I think one thing I appreciate is that I think with both, I'll speak on behalf of you, Bill, because of what you said before, but I think for both of us, the goal is to figure out what's true. Like I think neither of us were very excited about the idea of a debate. We're willing to do the structure, but we're not really debating this because I don't think either of us is the type of person that's set in our mindset and trying to prove something. I started out thoroughly believing in polygamy as God's eternal law, and I changed my mind on that, but I still thoroughly believed that Joseph Smith was the originator of polygamy, and it took a lot to get me to change my mind on that. So I'm very willing to not only change my mind, but to very publicly change my mind and to follow the evidence. So that's what I know that a lot of people like to say that I'm just completely biased where I can't see the evidence, but I would invite them to engage and maybe see if that might be the case for all of us. So that's my hope for this conversation. And Bill, I'm really excited. We said this is the first time we've spoken in person, so it's really good to finally meet, even just digitally.
Yeah, thank you. And same back at you. What I would add to this is that this all started some time ago, having a conversation with Lindsay Hansen Park on my end, Lindsay Hansen Park, Brian Buchanan, myself, and Radio Free Mormon. And we tried to lay out the evidence of what we saw as Joseph Smith originating polygamy. And over time, I mean, listening to some of your episodes, Michelle, listening to the conversation that I facilitated between Dan Vogel and Clark Abood has informed me a lot. I think there is evidence on both sides. And while I think you and I disagree today on how to approach these land deeds, I think it'll be interesting for the audience to hear it, as well as all the other issues that surround this. And I think there's enough that every Latter-day Saint who's interested in history should spend time considering both sides. And I hope today adds to that as a useful exercise for folks to gain information.
Yeah, I think that's
That's
great. Very well
great.
said, both of you. I think that's wonderful.
Can I
And
add
I
one
will,
more thing?
go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry, I just wanted to also clarify to the audience that we had some discussion as well, because this is a huge topic. So Bill and I today are specifically discussing land deeds as evidence of Joseph's polygamy, right? Is that a good way to frame it, Bill? Would you agree with that? And so I know that there's so much to talk about on this topic, but it's too big. So we just decided to limit it. So both of us are aware that this isn't a make or break discussion. Our goal is not to prove that Joseph was or was not a polygamist. We're just asking, are land deeds involved in Joseph Smith's polygamy?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that, Michelle. That's exactly right. And I'm sure that our viewers and listeners are aware, both Bill and Michelle have, and they've alluded to some of the podcasts they've had. We will put all these in the show notes. There is an immense amount of information out there on both of their podcasts that if any, I think this will just pique our interest, this discussion today. And I think you'll get the sense that there is so much more and you're probably going to want to dive in. So we'll put all that information in the show notes. So all right, I think we're ready to go. I think we will begin with Bill. And we were trying to be a little formal at first, like we said, not a debate, but a way to keep everybody on track. So this 15 minutes each at the beginning is just a way for everybody to kind of state their point of view. And so Landon, you're ready to be the timekeeper, right? For the 15 minutes. This is actually, I have to laugh. This is the RFM, tried and true version of debate. When I asked him, I said, how do you think we should do this? He goes, do this. So of course I always do everything he says. So this is what we're doing. But I think it's going to be great. So, and Landon will put a little thumbs up in the screen when we're close to the time to wrap up, and that'll help keep us on track. So, but other than that, we'll just naturally fall into a discussion. So
Well, it's good to know we have RFM to blame for the
you
format that
have
we're having to
RFM
follow.
I'm nervous
stamps
already.
all over this. That's right. So my goodness. All right. So we'll let Bill, whenever you're ready, just go ahead and Landon will kind of start the clock. And I think we also will have some media here to kind of explain what we're talking about in greater depth. So go ahead, Bill.
All right. So is my screen up there?
Yep.
Okay, sweet. So I did an episode diving into this. It's been a part of several episodes investigating this issue. So I put an episode out that dealt specifically with the land deeds because of some of Michelle's work, Clark Abood and Dan Vogel. I've revised that opinion to try to be more accurate. I think there are things that have been pointed out that are sort of flaws of my first go around. So I hope that this will be a better way to frame it. So let me start off with what I'm not arguing. My claim that the land deeds point to Joseph Smith as the originator of polygamy does not require that women rarely get land deeds. Whether women get few deeds solely or all the time does not impact my assertion. Second, my analogies, such as the marble jar, are an attempt to simplify what it is that I'm trying to explain in order to have it be more understandable or easily understood. It's not meant to be taken as an exact science, and even if deviations are suggested, which I welcome, I don't think that such would be significant enough to dispel my claim. So there's what I'm not arguing. So let me start by 1844, Nauvoo's population had swollen to 12,000 people. Again, based on a quote or two and some research on folks, this would be in 1842, 1843, 1844, and by a point in 1844, it grows to 12. I think, Michelle, you mentioned by 1845, it's back down to 11. It's rivaling the size of Chicago at the time. And let's begin with Michelle's stated average of around 8,000 over the course of those 3 years in population, and assume that half of that 8,000 are Mormon. And I think that's conservative. I think the reason why Nauvoo is such a large population is because of the Mormons. And so I think that's a conservative estimate. If half of the 4,000 Mormons are female, and let's assume that 2,000, let's assume that of the 2,000 remaining female Mormons, that 1,000 of them are reasonably potential women for polygamous marriages to Joseph Smith. And I think that's also conservative, again, considering the population of Nauvoo and also considering that Joseph Smith went as young, if he did practice polygamy, which I assert he did, as young as 14 years old with 2 of them, and then 15, 16, there's some at those ages as well. And then he goes as old as 47, 53, 58, and there's even one possible wife in her 70s, but I don't think that's considered strong evidence for that one. Of those 1,000 potential plural wives, 34 women are selected to get land deeds, and that number could be off. And I'm open to, by the way, as we move forward through this, as all the research gets done, I don't expect my numbers to be exact. I actually don't think it matters. I think the preponderance of deeds to women associated with polygamy is significant, even if you alter the numbers to some degree. So of the 1,000 potential plural wives, 34 women are selected to get land deeded to them without a husband present on the deed. And just over, I don't know what that X was supposed to be. Give me just a second. Sorry. 1/3, I believe, is what it is. So selected to get land deeded to them without a husband present on the deed, and just over 1/3 of them are falsely alleged to be plural wives later of Joseph and Hiram Smith, if Michelle's argument is right. So that ends up being 3.4%, 34 women who are eligible, they are getting deeds, 34, 33, 35 women who are alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith. And I'm taking a conservative estimate of 1,000 potential women that could be selected from. So why is 3.4% making up 30% of the deeds? Again, if there's only 34 women that Joseph Smith had as plural wives, and there's 1,000 potential women and 34 deeds given out, why is 3.4% of the population making up 30% of the deeds being given to women solely that end up being alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith or of Hiram Smith? If this is a conspiracy by Brigham Young after the fact, you either have to show that there is no preponderance of deeds given to the alleged wives of Smith, aka that the deeds were given significantly more often randomly to non-plural wives of Smith, statistically somewhere much closer to the 3.4%. In other words, let me see if I can explain this. You either have to lower the number of eligible women to such a low number that the 14 deeds given out to the plural wives of Joseph Smith or of Hiram Smith, which is one of them, that statistics make sense, or you have to lower the number of deeds that are actually plural wives of Joseph Smith, at least alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith. We should expect to find, based on the population and the women who were alleged to be wives of Joseph Smith, we should expect to find maybe one deed out of those 34. And 2 wouldn't seem strange. That would just be like a normal variance. And 3 wouldn't be crazy. 3 could be sort of noted as a coincidence, but a high number. But not 14. You have to supply a reason. The other option is you can supply a reason for why we find 13 more deeds to alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith beyond what probability deems expected. So you can also offer the solution that, okay, there is 14 deeds given to women who are the alleged wives of Joseph Smith. And we could explain that. One way we could explain that is to say there's another reason why that number is so high. And why did Brigham Young select those women to represent alleged wives of Joseph Smith, knowing they had deeds, for instance? I think maybe it would be one way around that. 34 women between the January 1st, 1842 and June 27th of 1844 are deeded land from Joseph Smith where no husband is on the deed. Why did I pick those years? Because that's when polygamy is happening. It wouldn't make sense to go back to 1825 because they're not even in Nauvoo, and it wouldn't make sense to go before 1842 because there's only a very minute number of polygamous marriages that are happening. And I think whatever the land deed connection is, I think it's tied to this very 3-year moment where polygamy is prevalent, and Joseph is trying to keep it under wraps and is sort of struggling to do so. Number 2, Joseph is in control, and if polygamy is happening, it is in full swing. Joseph Smith allegedly had approximately 34 wives. There's a lot of disagreement there, but again, most of the experts arrive at somewhere between 33 and 35. If the available LDS female population numbers approximately 1,000, again, I think a conservative estimate, or more, and Joseph had 34 alleged plural wives, then the chance of a single deed being given to one of those 34 women is 34 out of 1,000, or 3.4%. And while the probability of each alleged plural wife must be weighed against a random female in the available population, aka there is truth, and I think Michelle's statistician pointed this out as sort of a flaw in my theory, some women would likely have more or less of a chance of being selected for a deed and some women would have more or less of a chance of being selected as a plural wife. But that percentage should not be significantly higher than the 3.4%, and it certainly should not approach 30%. Now, there are only 34 deeds that are being given to women with no husband on the deed. The more of these deeds that are taken up by these 34 alleged plural wives, the lower and lower the percentage of chance goes that this is just a coincidence. It gets to the point where if a certain number of those deeds are given to the alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith, and we do not have a better explanation that's backed by evidence, then there comes a point where it is, for all intents and purposes, statistically impossible for a third, and I think the number could even be lower, 20%, for instance, of the deeds to go to alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith. And I likened this in my first episode to a jar of marbles. If you had, and I had 3,000 because that was my original way of framing it, but I'll say 1,000. Say you had a jar with 1,000 marbles in it, and you place 34 black marbles in the jar, and those 34 black marbles represent the alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith. And you shook that jar up, and you recognize that some marbles are bigger or smaller. Maybe your fingers will grab them a little easier. Hence, maybe women in the population that were more likely to get a deed, and also in the black marbles, maybe some of those are bigger. Women who would be more likely to be chosen as a plural wife of Joseph Smith. And so I acknowledge that my fat thumbs might end up grabbing some of the bigger marbles, more likely. But if I reach into the jar, and I pull a black marble out, like, okay, that seems not too far out of the ordinary. But if I pull out 10 marbles and 4 of them are black, it starts to seem like I didn't shake the jar up enough, that there was some sort of intention, something other than coincidence. And so while statisticians, including the one that you had, so by the way, when you have this jar of 1,000 marbles and you pull 34 marbles out, what ends up happening is that 14 of those marbles are black. And then when I pull, and then of the remaining set of marbles, a handful of those are also intertwined with the black marbles. They're connected in a way to the black marbles because they are the polygamous associations of Joseph Smith's associates, which also make up a significant number of those land deeds. And while statisticians, including the one, Michelle, that you had on your show, deem my analogy to be too simplified and not taking into account the complexity of each female, both in the population generally who get deeds and the 34 alleged wives of Smith, again, I note that while the probability of each alleged plural wife must be weighed against the random female in the available population, again, AKA some women will have more or less of a chance of being selected for a deed, and some women will more or less have a greater or lesser chance of being selected for a plural wife. That percentage should not be significantly higher than 3.4%. Maybe it's 5%, maybe even 7%. And we could argue that it's a coincidence, but it shouldn't approach 30%. You either have to show that there is no preponderance of deeds given to the alleged wives of Smith, AKA that deeds were given significantly more often, randomly, to non-plural wives of Smith, statistically somewhere much closer to the 3.4%, because that's what just basic probability would say it needs to be. Again, we should find one deed, maybe 2, maybe even 3, but not 14. Or you have to supply a reason for why we find 13 more deeds that are connected to the plural wives of Joseph and Hiram Smith, and that is significantly more than probability would deem we should expect. I'll sort of wrap up here. What I have on the screen are the deeds to Emma, 2 of them, the Mary Fielding Smith, which is Hiram's first wife. I tossed those out. They sort of don't count. They neither argue for a general person in the population. They also don't argue for a plural wife of Joseph Smith or Hiram. Then you get these deeds to alleged plural wives, which I, again, think are actual plural wives. Sarah Ann Whitney, Miranda Johnson, Eliza Partridge, Sarah Scott Mulholland, Flora Ann Woodworth, Sylvia Sessions, Helen Mar Kimball, Mary Elizabeth Rawlings Leitner, Patty Bartlett Sessions, Elizabeth Davis Durfee, and then the deed to Hiram's plural wife, Lydia Dibble Granger. And I don't need for my theory to hold up, my assertions to hold up, I don't need every single one of these to pan out. Michelle's welcome to eliminate one or two of them or three of them. I still think there's a statistically significant preponderance of deeds given to women who practiced, who were alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith. The other thing, it doesn't matter that some of the deeds weren't given to alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith, because I'm self-admitting on the front end that not every deed was given to a plural wife. It's the high number of deeds given to plural wives that matter. So far, 2 women, 3 deeds are legal wives of Joseph and Hiram. I sort of discard those. 11 women, 10 deeds are the alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith, and 1 woman is the plural wife of Hiram Smith. This accounts for 14 of the 34 land deeds. This is beyond coincidence. Even if you argue 1 or 2 of those cases shouldn't count. Then there's these other 18 deeds, and Thalanda Merrick, I may not pronounce these right, Charity Stoddard, Martha Knight, Elmira Miller, Elizabeth Buchanan Coolidge, Sally Waterman Phelps, Elizabeth Matthews, Marianne Price, Melissa LeBaron Johnson, Matilda Lyman, for which there is a connection to Nauvoo polygamy. So again, the deeds being given out with Joseph Smith overseeing those has a deep connection even after the 14 to Joseph Smith's polygamy. And again, you can eliminate 1 of those or 2 of those or 3 of those, but there's still a significantly high preponderance of them having a connection, which has to be explained otherwise. So now we got the 34 land deeds. We note that there's the 14. Now we've got somewhere around another 10 that are heavily connected to polygamy of Joseph Smith's associates. That's 24 out of 34 land deeds that are given to single women, or at least a woman without a husband listed on the deed, and with 14 of them directly connected to Joseph and Hiram Smith. Think about how bad this is. Not only are 1/3 of the deeds within these parameters Joseph's alleged plural wives, when we are strangely supposed to believe he wasn't practicing polygamy, but another 1/3 of the women are connected closely to Nauvoo polygamy too. These are the very people that the polygamy deniers argue Joseph is trying to put down and distance himself from. Seems strange that he's giving them land. And so, sort of finishing up, I would just note that we can finagle the formula. We can take a few people off. We can add more to the population. We can take people out of the population. But we still have to deal with the fact that we find way more deeds connected to Joseph Smith's polygamy and Nauvoo polygamy than what random chance, what coincidence, and even allowing a few oddballs to make its way in there as a coincidence, but raising the number beyond what we would expect. It's far beyond that. And so there has to be an explanation for why these deeds are connected to these very women who are connected to Joseph Smith's polygamy.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. And again, reminding the listeners and viewers that there is so much more to this. Look at everybody's podcast. Look at all the source material. There's a lot. So now we'll hear from Michelle and Landon. I think you can just go ahead and modify the time based on what Bill took, and we'll let Michelle take the time that she needs. So go ahead, Michelle. This is going to be great. So interesting so far. Just love it.
Okay, so let's see how I share my screen.
Yeah.
Don't start my time yet.
No, I know we're like such taskmasters. And again, this is informal. We're just trying to keep some kind of, organization,
Yes.
right? It's all RFM's
I did
fault.
try
I'm telling you,
hard.
it's all his fault. So.
I know if it's RFM, we'll let him know. Yeah, I spoke fast when I timed this, so hopefully I'll be kind of close.
Yeah.
But I apologize for starting out with sort of an annoying screen. I just wanted to let people know that I have done. Can you see my screen now? Is it the annoying one?
Yeah,
And I'm not trying to self-promote. I'm just letting people know these 2 specific episodes I did responded directly to Bill. And so I am trying to squish down the 4 massive episodes I've done on deeds into 15 minutes. The best I can. I can't possibly include it all. I'll do my best. So first, I want to point out something that I have seen in Bill's kind of shifting claims. So he starts with, and I hear that he just eliminated that, but he starts with proclaimed that we shouldn't see deeds to women before 1861. And based on a misunderstanding that deeds to women are an anomaly only seen in Nauvoo with Joseph Smith. So having made the connection between deeds and women deeds to women and supposed wives in his Mormon discussion, I know this isn't, I'm just kind of going through the progression that I've seen. In his Mormon discussion episodes, he says this about the deeds to women.
At least 75% of them, I think it was higher than that, but at least 75% of them were plural wives of Joseph Smith. And so the moment you make that connection, you begin to sense that something's going on here.
Were you guys able to hear that? Did that work? Okay, great. Okay, so then, let's see, I lost my spot when I asked you guys that. Let me keep going. And so there he believes that it's 75% of deeds to women are to Joseph's supposed wives. And then in his smoking gun episode, after he had done a lot more research, he acknowledged that it was only, which he just presented 10 deeds of, what happened? Something's going on. It was only 10 of 34 deeds, and were to wives. I actually corrected it in my episode to 11 deeds because I think he left Martha McBride Knight off. So you can see I'm trying to still man the arguments as I encounter them. But then it's suddenly, later in his discussion with Dan Vogel, it suddenly became 87% of deeds were to wives. So I'll play that clip.
It seems really strange that 87% of the single women given land deeds in Nauvoo also happen to be the alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith. So we ought to trust that there's a connection here, and that almost assuredly every single woman getting a land deed in Nauvoo is in fact a plural wife of Joseph Smith.
So you can hear that there, it jumped up to 87%, and then it suddenly jumped to 100% with him saying almost assuredly every single woman getting a land deed in Nauvoo is in fact a plural wife of Joseph Smith. And so I have a reason that I'm going over this that I want to get to. But I understand that Bill may have misspoken here, but people have been repeating and spreading these same claims based on Bill's statement, so it matters. And so then Bill goes on to say this in that same discussion. Is it not going to play?
They are evidence. They are connected to the land deeds on one hand equal the plural wives of Joseph Smith. And I know folks like Michelle Stone will rush in and go, well, not every single woman. So how do we, I don't care about getting 100%. 87% is statistically significant enough that you can't just wipe it away with a brush of the hand. It has to be dealt with.
So I assume that Bill knows at this point, after watching my episodes, that I have absolutely been dealing with it. And I just wanted to point out, in case you couldn't hear, because I had to listen to several times when Bill sort of strawmans my argument, that Dan scoffs and says that's quibbling. And I think that this is demonstrative of why people tend to write me off as an idiot or just, ideologically possessed or whatever, because I'm being misrepresented and the ideas are also being misrepresented. So I think it's important. So if you noticed in those clips, we went from 75% to 10 out of 34 deeds, which I understand, as I said, Bill did more research, but then for no apparent reason, at least that I've been able to see, it jumped to 87%, and then even to every single woman in getting a land deed in Nauvoo. So this kind of sort of, I'm not trying to be rude, just I was writing quickly, this kind of sloppy thinking that's not careful enough, that I'm also seeing, as I said, by Bill's listeners in my comments, is what I think we should all try to avoid so we don't make bad assumptions and spread false information. Along with what I see as sloppy thinking, I'm also seeing both in Bill's episodes and in many of the comments of people who have listened to Bill's episodes, I'm seeing a lot of straw manning, appeals to authority, circular reasoning, ad hominem attacks, and other fallacies that I know that Bill generally opposes. So I'm hoping we can work together to elevate the level of discourse and correct the mistaken thinking that has been adopted and spread on this episode. I'm really hoping to get back to the original source. Let's see, it didn't go forward.
They are evidence.
Okay, go to the next slide. Don't play it. Okay, I'm really hoping I will have time. We'll have time in this discussion to get back to the original source that first ties deeds to polygamy, but I don't know. There's just so much to cover. I'm hoping we'll be able to discuss that. First, I just want to respond quickly to Bill's specific claims about deeds being evidence of wives, Nauvoo deeds being evidence of wives. So the first to the false assumption Bill already covered, that deeds to women were rare because they were not valid or legal. There are literally hundreds of deeds to and from women, including married women listed without their husbands, just in Nauvoo alone, let alone throughout the rest of the country. Bill knows there are thousands of pages of compiled deeds. I probably should stick with my notes because I'll say that again. I've gone through several hundred of them, but well, not even like a couple hundred of them. And I already just found dozens and dozens just in my random searching while working on deeds. And let's see that I just said that out of order. So I believe I included around 40 deeds to women in my episode, but I'll just include a few here. I chose these examples because the examples I chose specifically because they are deeds from early Nauvoo polygamists to women who were not their wives, or to the wives of those early Nauvoo polygamists from men who were not their husbands, or from couples who they were also not married to. Most of them fall within Bill's selected dates that I take issue with. But although with these deeds, it doesn't matter because these men weren't killed in 1844. So their polygamy, as soon as Joseph and Hiram were killed, these men's polygamy exponentially increased from that point on. So this first page, you can see deeds from Brigham Young, just from Brigham Young to Susanna Brunel, another deed from Brigham and his wife Marianne to Susan Ann Brunel. I don't know if that's the same person or two different women, but it doesn't matter. Neither of them were ever Brigham's wives. Then we have a deed from Brigham and Marianne to Sarah Hillman, also never a wife of Brigham Young. We have, I will say, I didn't find a single deed from Brigham or any of these men to any of their wives. That just wasn't something that happened. So I'm not cherry picking here. These are all of the deeds from Brigham Young to women. Same here with deeds to Marianne Young. So you can see my screen is cut off from sharing, but it's from John and maybe Julia, I can't remember her name, to Marianne. And then a deed from Ethan Kimball to Marianne Young, the wife of Brigham Young. Those notes are added by, with her name, Susan Easton Black, in her compilation. They're not on the original deed. I'll mention that just because sometimes you get something a little bit off. And then this other one from Ethan Kimball to Marianne is a $900 deed, also nothing to do with marriage, with polygamy. Then here's a deed from Heber and Violet Kimball to Margaret Simpson, and another one to Anne Simpson, also both never married to Heber Kimball. There is no deed from Heber Kimball to any wife. Man, this was interesting. I know these fall outside of the dates, but they fall within the dates of Willard Richards' involvement in polygamy. So the first one to Janetta Richards, Willard Richards' wife, and the second one to Janetta Richards after Joseph's death, but still doing very well in Willard Richards' involvement of polygamy. And let's see how many more I have. Well, this one I thought was interesting. So this first one is from William Clayton, a well-known Nauvoo polygamist, to a woman that was never his wife. And then this second one I included, I thought was very interesting. This is from William and Jane Law, the president of the Nauvoo Expositor and the new church that was developed, to Ruth Clayton, William Clayton's wife. So I think that this demonstrates pretty adequately that deeds to women were not relevant to polygamy. So let's see where I wanted to go here. Oh, I didn't include the many deeds I found either to or from Sarah Foster, or from Robert and Sarah Foster to other women. I mentioned her because just like William Law, her husband, Robert Foster, was a central player in the Nauvoo Expositor, and he repeatedly deeded land to women and either had his wife buy deeds or bought deeds in her name. There are several to her as well. So there are many, many more where this came from, but I hope these few adequately demonstrate the deeds to women were actually quite common and had nothing to do with polygamy. So the foundational assumption that I know Bill has let go of now, but it still matters how common deeds are. And it's apparent that they are very common and they are not evidence of any kind of funny business by Joseph Smith. So next, let's see, I have to keep going back and forth between screens. Next, despite the mistaken claims that anywhere between 75 to 87 to 100% of Nauvoo deeds to women were to Joseph Smith's wives, there is in fact quite poor correlation between deeds Joseph Smith sold to women and his supposed wives. Since Bill used the wives from Wikipedia, he includes one of the wives from Wikipedia in his list, which includes not only Todd Compton's and Brian Hale's, but also Fawn Brody's and George D. Smith's lists of wives, which I think is relevant because those are the players that have gotten us to the mindset that we have where we know for certain that Joseph was a polygamist. Here's a list of all of the wives included by Wikipedia. The ones in red are the ones with deeds. As you can see, less than 25% of supposed wives were included on deeds. Among the 75% of wives that were not included on deeds are such well-known wives as Louisa Beaman, Zina Huntington, Agnes Coolbrith, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, Melissa Lott, and even Eliza Snow. So we have to ask, if Joseph is deeding property to wives, why did he include only 1/4 of them and not even his beloved Eliza from all of the stories that she would later tell? As Bill would say to me, this needs to be addressed and not just ignored or waved away. In addition, less than 33% of deeds to women were to supposed wives. So if deeds are about polygamy, how do we explain the 66% of deeds Joseph sold to women who were never claimed to be his wives? Not to mention, I know that Bill is kind of doing the connect the dots, like this person was involved with polygamy. Almost all of those were involved with polygamy later after Joseph's death, which lends itself to what my interpretation of any potential overlap is. So I don't think that, and if you are trying to just connect people to polygamy that way, you can't just look at the deeds to women. You need to look at all of Joseph's deeds and see if he was deeding land primarily to polygamists, and if that was the reason why. There's no reason to limit it to just the deeds to women at that point. So let's see. So yes, so not the hundreds of deeds to women throughout Nauvoo. All of this needs to be accounted for. How do we explain all of these deeds to women if they're about polygamy? And so I wanted to, I also found many deeds to groups of siblings, similar to the deed to the Partridge siblings, which Bill counts as evidence of Joseph marrying and giving property to Emily and Eliza, despite their 2 younger sisters and their younger brother also being included on the deed. So this is something that I think is worth looking into. Here are a few more examples of parents, I believe, buying deeds for their children. This is a deed to let's see, the first one is to John Taylor's children, and then another one to Amasa Lyman's children, and then you'll see another one to Porter Rockwell's children. All of these aren't from Joseph Smith. Of course, the majority of deeds in Nauvoo were written by Joseph Smith because he was the trustee in trust. I shouldn't say a majority, not a majority, just he bought and sold more deeds than any other individual because he was the trustee in trust. But you can see that there are deeds going around from everybody in Nauvoo. And so let's see. In addition, I will say, because I know that the 3 deeds to teenage girls seemed very suspicious to many, including me. That was one of the things that made me go, whoa, this is interesting. I'll add that I also found several deeds to girls of all ages without similar deeds to their brothers. I found enough to clearly demonstrate that they were not all that unusual and that they had nothing to do with polygamy. So let me show you just a few examples of these as well. This is a deed to William Smith's 7 and 4-year-old daughters, Mary Jane and Caroline. And there's also deeds to John Taylor's very young daughters. This is 2 deeds to Lenora and another one to Mary Ann. They were both under 10 years old at the time that these deeds were purchased. There are no corresponding deeds to his son. There are several more deeds to girls we could look at, all of which have nothing to do with polygamy. My best explanation for these, after looking at several of them, is that the parents were buying dowries for their daughters, which was a common practice at that time, especially in England. It was happening in America, but it was especially in England, where many of the saints, including John Taylor, who bought these deeds for his daughters, emigrated from. You can just read any Jane Austen book to see how important dowries were. Again, I cover these things much more in my episodes responding directly to Bill. So let's see. Oh, I was going to take the slides off now for a minute, but I'll just keep going. So there are other problems with Bill's hypothesis. He claims we should actually ignore parts of the historical record by disregarding the purchase prices clearly listed on the deeds. He continually says that they were given deeds. I'm left asking if that applies only to deeds from Joseph Smith to these particular women, or to all deeds from Joseph Smith, or all Nauvoo land deeds. It seems to me that he is assuming, with no evidence at all, that the listed purchase price on the deeds was faked and should be ignored. And so again, exactly which deeds that applies to has not been defined. I do talk about the $1,000 deeds in my episode, which does seem to at times be a stand-in price for something else, but it's not about polygamy. I also need to point out that there are dozens and dozens of deeds with the purchase price of $1. So there is no need to fake prices, to write a fake price on a deed when it was really being given rather than sold. That was a common practice that happened often, especially with Joseph Smith. And so let's see, next slide. Bill also completely ignores the dates of the deeds, other than making sure they fit within his, in my perspective, cherry-picked parameters. I think you have to come to this with already believing that Joseph was a polygamist and that deeds are about polygamy to justify limiting the deeds to the dates when we would expect to see polygamy. And so let's see. When we are trying to understand if there's any possible relationship between deeds and sealings, the dates matter immensely, especially compared to the supposed sealing dates. Some deeds are months or years before supposed sealing dates, and some are months or years after. This also needs to be explained. In addition to ignoring important evidence clearly written on the deeds simply because it doesn't support his desired conclusion, Bill also fails to provide any explanation of exactly how deeds are supposedly related to marriages. Was Joseph bribing women to marry him? Was it his way of providing for them? Again, this is an area where dates and prices must be carefully examined, as well as the list of women, the list of supposed wives who did or did not receive deeds. At least some proposed explanation of exactly how deeds relate to marriage is absolutely essential, because we need to be able to check the evidence to see if it supports or refutes the claim. For any hypothesis to be credible or worth consideration, it must be falsifiable. A hypothesis that doesn't contain enough information to be tested and proven wrong is little more than a slogan. So one silly example of that is hope and change that we remember from a few years ago. No one knows exactly what that means, so it's hard to know to define whether or not it was accomplished in any objective way. Okay,
Michelle,
next slide.
your time's up, Michelle. So.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a lot more to go.
Yeah,
Bill, can I have a little more time and then I'll give you more time after?
Yeah, oh yeah. Just we'll pick it back up after Bill has a chance to respond here. That's why I wondered if the timing was, but yeah, let's let Bill kind of respond to what you said before so far, and then you can pick it up right here. We'll remember this slide right here. So
okay, I'll remove my slides. Bill, you're muted, so I wasn't able to share you.
Yeah, no worries.
I'm able to hear you and sharing slides.
All right.
And so maybe we need more than 5 minutes. Maybe we need 10 in between each. We'll let Bill.
Was that my 15? That was the equal time.
That was 17. Isn't that crazy? I know it goes so fast. Bill had 16.
I guess 17. I know.
I know. I didn't know either. I'm like, Landon, what time is it? It goes so fast because it's so absolutely fascinating.
Well, how about this, Bill? Could I finish? Could I take my 5 minutes right now? Then you have 10, or then you have.
The only downside is I just won't need it, and so it's sort of will end up very uneven.
All right, let's let Bill just go.
I know. I said to them, I'm kind of the underdog.
10 minutes now, Bill. Yeah. Let's do our original plan, 10 for Bill and then 10 more for Michelle to finish. And then we'll just go to more of a back and forth. So Bill, go ahead for 10 minutes. We'll give you the thumb at 8 minutes.
And I'll be able to see it this time.
Okay.
Yep. So first off, the Illinois law has nothing to do with my assertion. I know I made that point in the beginning, but it was just it was a secondary point. It has nothing to do with the assertion at all. It doesn't impact the math. So the Illinois law isn't an issue. The one point Michelle's right on is that at times I've spoken off the cuff, and I have said 75 and 87, obviously. But what I'm speaking of is in today's presentation is 30%, which even if we went down to 20%, even if we went down to 10%, it would be statistically significant, and that has yet to be dealt with. Number 3.
I ran out of time.
What's that?
I said because I ran out of time.
Yeah, no worries. You'll get that in the next 10 minutes.
We'll pick it right up. That's right.
So let's see here. So the way I can sort of relate this, Michelle's talking about how 12 of the 50 of Joseph Smith's wives only got a deed. And she points to a lot of people who didn't get, who got deeds who weren't tied to polygamy. And it's like if they did a cancer study and there were 1,000 people in this geographic area. And we found that there was a significantly high number of people in that geographic area who had cancer. You wouldn't go, well, there's a group of the population who don't have cancer, so there must not be any relationship to the area causing cancer, something in that area. If we find a significantly high preponderance of people with cancer in a geographic area, it doesn't matter that some of the people don't have cancer. There's still going to have to be some research done about why cancer is so significantly high in that area. And it doesn't matter that we find people with cancer in a completely different geographic location. So when she points to why didn't the other wives of Joseph Smith get land, I don't care. What I know is what yet to be dealt with, which is that of the deeds that were given, a significant preponderance of them that we, beyond what we should expect, are the plural wives of Joseph Smith. I don't care about fake deed prices. It also doesn't impact my assertion. Whether people paid for the deeds or whether they didn't still doesn't affect the fact that there are a significantly high number of people in the 34 deeds given, or whatever number you pick, that are connected directly to Joseph and Hiram Smith's alleged polygamy. The dates of the sealing being distant, I don't care. And the reason I don't care is because you still have to deal with why, of those deeds that were given to women with no man listed, why such a heavy preponderance of them are to the plural wives of Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. And, I've done research in terms of trying to come to this conversation today to make sure that my numbers were more accurate to what they are. I'm still admitting I might be wrong. There might be way more deeds than the 34. Maybe Michelle's going to tell us there's 70 deeds between 1842 and 1844. And maybe she's going to knock off of those 14 women. Maybe she'll knock them down to 10. And we still would have a problem, which is we still have to explain why so many of those deeds are the alleged plural wives of Joseph Smith. So most of the points that Michelle made just now are secondary, and they don't actually affect the assertion, such as the Illinois law, such as me getting the numbers wrong in the past. We have to deal with just the deeds themselves and how many of them are attributed to the alleged wives of Smith. And we have to have a reasonable explanation for that requires less conjecture and allowances than that Joseph Smith is the originator of polygamy.
All right. Boy, you came in under time. This is great. Do
I
you have
know.
anything more to add to
Good
that,
job,
Bill?
Bill.
No, we're all good. Okay, go ahead, Michelle. And you can pick up right where you left off if you want, or if you want to address what Bill just
Okay.
said and then go back to it, whatever you want. We'll give you 10 right here.
Bill, you might have to lend me the rest of your time. I'm going to go as fast as I can,
Ah.
though. But I'm going to
This
start
is
at the end of my
so precise.
presentation. I'll start at the end of what I was going to present because it responds to Bill, and then I'll go back to where I started. So I'll need to add
Perfect.
my slides. So maybe just give me a little bit extra time. So, okay. So I did want to respond to the people that say that none of this evidence matters because the overlap between deeds and supposed wives proves the case, which is what I'm hearing Bill say. And so, as I said, I think it is. I do appreciate you, Bill, correcting the record, and because people are under the impression that there is just this huge, massive majority of deeds with the overlap. But we're talking about a relatively small overlap, which actually surprises me how small it is, and I'll tell you why. The explanation for the overlap between deed purchases in Nauvoo and later involvement with polygamy seems to me to be quite clear. The people, and also they weren't selected, they self-selected. People chose to purchase deeds, right? The people who bought deeds from Joseph Smith were faithful members of the church who were committed to helping build up what they saw as Zion. After Joseph's death, the majority of those same people followed Brigham Young to Utah, where they continued to, in their mind, build the kingdom, where 8 years later, polygamy was officially announced and espoused, and where decades later, the way to build the kingdom became defending polygamy against the RLDS church and the US government. That's when we get the first claims of any of Joseph's specific wives of who they were. And that's when those began to be gathered. So that more than adequately explains any overlap. It's the same pool of faithful saints who were buying deeds, then came to Utah and were defending polygamy. And I will add, I can't get into it now, but the evidence for many of these wives is not very good at all. Many, if not most of them, I haven't done the math exactly, but many of them never claimed themselves to have been wives. They were women in Nauvoo who knew Joseph Smith, the same group that would be buying deeds. So I think that that's a very adequate explanation. And now if you'll just stop my time for a second so I can find my place again and add my slides, I will continue.
We're
So
trying to be very
let's see what it
flexible.
was.
We don't want, we're like, time it makes everybody
Okay.
crazy. So we'll just be
Here we go.
good from here on out. So yeah, let's
Okay.
pick it up where you left off
So
before.
if you
This is
can
great.
So you can share my screen. So I was saying, since Bill did a statistical analysis, I went out and reached out to several universities and was able to connect with a completely unbiased PhD professor of statistics who had never studied anything about Joseph Smith's polygamy and didn't have any idea who either Bill or I were, and who, despite his extremely busy schedule, was actually willing to watch both of Bill's videos and respond. One of the main responses he brought up was, oops, I've got to go back. Let's see if I can go back. Was the Texas sharpshooter fallacy describe some of the problems he saw in Bill's analysis. He said that while he always appreciates people trying to utilize statistics, his expert opinion is that a simple statistical analysis is not an adequate tool for this question. I'm going to have to skip forward a little bit, so I can't explain, but he doesn't think that it's an accurate or useful model because there are too many assumptions that have to be made. He advised people to do more thinking before accepting conclusions based on Bill's statistical analysis of deeds. And I'll share one quote that he said. This is Dr. Kidd. He said, statisticians will never commit to anything 100%, but I will say that the probabilities that the assumed model is correct are very, very low. And so finally, and so that's the response. I think that's as expert as you can get of a response to Bill's statistical argument. Finally, Bill's discovery of one or two new wives. Part of the importance of a hypothesis like this is it needs to have predictive power. So I like that Bill used his hypothesis in a predictive way to say, can we use deeds to predict new wives? And so based on John Bennett's Mrs. G and Miss B, I cover both in my episodes, but I'll only take time to look at Jane Gully here. Hopefully I'll have time. There are several important things to point out. So John Bennett left Nauvoo in spring of 1842 and wrote his 6 letters and published his book, the one that lists Miss G, the same year. So Joseph would have needed to be married to Miss G at least by 1842 in order for Bennett to have included her in his book. From all the records we have, it seems clear that Samuel and Jane Gully and their 3 children did not arrive in Nauvoo until the summer of 1843. Again, I go over that evidence in my episode. So Jane Gully wasn't even in Nauvoo until after John Bennett had already been chased out and published his book. In addition, there's no evidence that Jane ever even met or interacted with Joseph Smith. But this is more important. Jane's deed was not written until May 20th, 1844. Again, 2 full years after Bennett had left, less than a year after Jane had arrived. And this specific date is even more important because just 2 days before, on May 18th, 1844, Lyman White wrote a note to Joseph Smith asking him to transfer a lot Lyman owned to Samuel Gully. You can see what it says there. Brother Joseph, you'll please give the lot to Samuel Gully, which is for me on your book. Then 2 days later, we have the deed from Joseph to Samuel's wife, Jane. This also demonstrates another example of the very common practice of signing deeds to wives. Please note the exact lot recorded on the deed. It's lot 2 in block 141. In case there's still any question, William Clayton, in addition to writing the deeds himself and recording them himself in his own Nauvoo registry, he also kept another master list called the Trustees' Book of Land Deeds. Here you can see the exact lot on the deed, lot number 2 in block 141, assigned to Jane Gully with G. Miller and L. White, that's Lyman White, who wrote the note to Joseph Smith, scratched out underneath. So I think this more than adequately accounts for Jane Gully's deed, and I think we can eliminate her as a possible wife. I won't take time to go into Marianne Bosley, but she has just as many problems as a candidate for a wife. So I think that more than adequately demonstrates the problems with this theory. It does not have any predictive ability. I would hope that no one would continue to argue that Jane Gully is a wife. What does have predictive ability is, as I said, the overlap between between the saints in Nauvoo who were choosing to purchase land deeds and the saints who followed Brigham Young and later became defenders of polygamy. How am I on time? Am I out?
No, you got about 2 minutes.
Well, then I will save it for another response because
there you go.
I just finished that was my first 15.
Very good. We're keeping a bank of it's just so much. That's right. Everyone talk at once. Let's just solve it that way. All right, Bill, do you have any thoughts on what Michelle just presented?
So first, in regards to the Gully and Bosley, I eliminated them. I mentioned them only as an interesting point, but I admitted in any time I've ever covered this issue, and it's never been a part of my conclusions. I've always eliminated Jane Gully. I've always eliminated Bosley. They've never been a part of this. So to bring them up is sort of also a distraction. It's not part of my statistics. It's not part of my numbers. I appreciated your statistician you had on. What he was essentially, I think, getting at, if we had a geographic area with 1,000 people and the cancer rate was 3.4%, we would expect to find 3.4 people in that geographic area who have cancer. What we find in this situation is we find 14 people. None of those are Gully or Bosley. So we find 14, and then we find a few other people who are precancerous beyond the normal expectation as well. And what the statistician is saying is that it would be inappropriate to conclude with any certainty that it's the water that's causing it, or that it's the factory that's down the street. Rather, we got to be really careful about conclusions, and I agree with that. So I'm not saying that I know for a fact that this makes this conclusion true, even if I name the original the smoking gun, right? What I'm getting at is that the most reasonable, rational conclusion, when we find 14 people in a geographic area of 1,000 that have cancer when we should only expect to find 3.5, has to be explained somehow. And the most rational conclusion is that it's tied to Joseph Smith's polygamy, because the cancer is the fact that these are the alleged wives of Joseph Smith. We still have to account for that. And I don't think up until this moment, Michelle has still offered a solution to that problem. We've gotten a lot of things which aren't part of my assertion. But at the end of the day, we're still going to have to deal with, why are there so many deeds given to the plural wives of Joseph Smith and of Hiram Smith? I'll just put back up here on the screen again. So you've got those folks. Again, we should expect to find not the top three, eliminate those. Those don't stand out. It's those deeds to Sarah Ann Whitney, Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde, the Partridge sisters, Sarah Scott Mulholland, Flora Ann Woodworth, Sylvia Sessions, Helen Mar Kimball, Mary Elizabeth Rawlings Leitner, Patty Bartlett Sessions, Elizabeth Davis Durfee, and a deed to Lydia Dibble Granger. We should expect to see about one of these deeds, maybe two, maybe three, and instead we see, I believe, 14 of those deeds. And I'm okay, again, lowering that number, raise that number, lower the population, raise the population. We still have to figure out why so many people in Nauvoo have cancer. And the most reasonable, rational conclusion is Joseph Smith's polygamy.
So
Right.
I want
Thank you, Bill.
I want to first make a request, just like Bill, I have requested that to be more careful with your numbers, because people are spouting everywhere that all of the women or the vast majority of the women, or, so I think we need to be more careful with language. I'm also going to request that we stop saying deeds were given and instead say deeds were sold, because that, it is very disingenuous to keep claiming they were given when the historical record claims that they were sold. If you want to show us some evidence, like I do with the $1,000 deeds, if you want to show some evidence why we should know that we should ignore prices on deeds and which deeds the prices should be ignored on, that would be helpful. But until then, I think we need to acknowledge that they were purchased and that they were sold. And
How
then,
about if we say deeds are transferred?
That would be fine. That's perfect. If you want to say that. But so I think the cancer analogy is interesting. I feel this is really interesting because it's kind of like nothing I'm saying is being dealt with. They'll just keep saying that I'm not dealing with his presumptions, and I feel like I am extensively, because I'm showing that they don't have predictive ability, that they're insufficient, that they don't hold up. And I have proposed, I think, a far more likely explanation. So it's interesting. It feels like if we're using the cancer analogy, if there are 1,000 people and 11 have cancer, then Bill is saying, it's the water, it's the water, it's the water. And come out and show receipts and say, look, those 14 people bought these toys or used this paint in their home. They used green paint, has now been found to be carcinogenic. So we can tie the paint directly to the cancer. But Bill just keeps saying, no, because there are 1,000 people and 14 have cancer, so it has to be the water. That's what I feel like is happening. And so I want to really quickly, if I have any time left, because I think that this is also relevant. Let's see if I can go back and Let's see. How do I share my screen while Bill is sharing his?
We can just stop.
Is
Yeah.
that-
Yeah, we'll stop, Bill, and put yours up.
Okay. Okay, so I just want to really quickly go to this part of what I had wanted to talk about. And let's see if I can get it on there, because I think that this is relevant. We don't have time to go fully as I would like to into the original deed that started this all, but I think that this is just some good information for people to understand as they're coming to this topic. So, and to explain the initial connections to deeds. So Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, the top two guys in the polygamous church, were lifelong best friends who were baptized together and joined the church together. They oversaw the creation of the new narrative, what Brigham calls the new order of things. Willard Richards was Brigham's cousin and also lifelong friend, and was Joseph's journal keeper and the official church historian until his death. He wrote Joseph Smith's history under the direction of Brigham Young, editing and forging countless documents along the way. And in addition to being together most of their lives, they were all together in England on their missions when all of this came about. They had, I'll skip over most of this, but where Brigham Young admitted multiple times, he claimed that this is one example from his October 8th, 1866 sermon. He said, "I knew the doctrine of polygamy by revelation to myself while I was in England, before it was revealed to me by Joseph." And so the young William Clayton, will it go? The young William Clayton was baptized and ordained by Heber C. Kimball and trained up by these leaders, where all of their letters and journals show extensive evidence of the development and practice of these ideas. They contain a lot of very spiritual wifery sounding, or at least godly womanizing sounding content. And there's much more, and I could give you a couple of examples, but this is from Heber C. Kimball's journal, where he and a woman that he spent a lot of time with, they were together day and night. And this is one record where it's tried to be scratched out, but you can clearly see we washed our feet and went to bed. And there's another example. This is from Brigham Young's journal. There are so many I could have chosen, where it says questions to ask Joseph Smith. One of them is, was David a man after God's own heart? And so the reason that this is relevant is because William Clayton is the one who claimed the original deed was to Emma was related to polygamy in his journal. And I'm sure I'm out of time, and I didn't want to go too far afield. This just relates directly because of how we get the claims of who the wives were, and how we get the claims of how this all fits together comes from William Clayton and Willard Richards. And they were in Nauvoo. They were Nauvoo polygamists, and they were also later Utah polygamists. So it's very relevant to show what I already said. I think the cause for the cancer is the carcinogenic paint, not the water, because I can show the receipts. In the same way, I will say the cause for the overlap between Nauvoo deeds and polygamist is the fact that it's the same pool of faithful saints who were purchasing deeds in Nauvoo, who went to Utah and either became or started making claims about polygamy. That's the explanation.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. That is very interesting. I like your graphics, by the way. Bill, what do you have to say?
Out of that one.
So Dan Vogel addressed at least a couple of the points that Michelle made, and I thought quite well. I'll give one example. To say that these deeds were faked later doesn't make a lot of sense. There's the deed with Emma Smith, for instance. It originally says Hiram. Clark Abood pointed to that. And Dan showed that when it was actually filed, it had Emma's name in it. Hence, it couldn't be an afterthought by Brigham Young later on. So Michelle said I haven't dealt with the things she's brought up. Deed prices don't affect my assertion. Distance between dates, as long as the date of the sealing doesn't come significantly after the date of the deed, I would be open to maybe those ones needing to come off. But if they come significantly before, those are plural wives of Joseph Smith, and whether he gives a deed within 2 days or whether he does it within 6 months, I don't think impacts my assertion. The Illinois law doesn't impact my assertion. The deeds given, not given to plural wives. So the plural wives, sorry, deed transfer. I'll say
transferred.
The deeds transferred. The deeds that were not transferred to plural wives of Joseph Smith. In other words, just random female citizens of Nauvoo. Doesn't matter. The fact that we find people that don't have cancer doesn't mean that there's a cancer problem when we find a preponderance of cancer beyond what we would reasonably expect because of the statistical showing up of cancer in a group of people. The deeds given to the deeds transferred, not transferred to other plural wives of Joseph Smith, the other wives of Joseph Smith who didn't get a deed, also doesn't affect my assertion. What it comes down to, and I still don't think, even with her saying it's a conspiracy by Brigham Young, I still don't think that she has demonstrated that these deeds transferred to the alleged wives of Joseph Smith have any evidence of being fraudulently created. Hence, we're still back to the premise of my argument. You either have to show that there is no preponderance of deeds given, transferred to the alleged wives of Smith, aka that the deeds were given significantly more often, randomly to non-plural wives of Smith, statistically somewhere much closer to the 3.4%, explain that we should expect, and I'm me saying, we should expect to find 1, maybe 2, 3 would be crazy, but not out of hand. We shouldn't expect to find 10 or 11 or 14. Or you have to supply a better reason that requires less allowances and less conjecture for why we find 13 more deeds to the alleged plural wives than probability deems expected. So what I'm saying is that everyone seems to be, the tests coming back say that the water is much more cancer causing than normal water in other places. And there's a higher amount of cancer. We can't prove yet that it's the water, but until you have a better answer, it's the most reasonable, rational conclusion. I'm trying to think offhand what else I would want to say about that. I think I'll stop there.
Excellent, Michelle.
Can I just, if there is a few minutes left, can I ask, Michelle, you agree that, and you can give me whatever you think your number is. I say there's 34.
Can I respond first and then?
Oh, please.
I respond first and you
please.
say, I want to answer your question. I just kind of know what I want to say.
Well, by all means, please.
First, if that's all right. And if you'll stop sharing your screen, I'll share mine. But first of all, I want to clarify, I have never in any way claimed that deeds were manufactured after the fact. That's never been part of my argument. And I also still find it fascinating that the conversation is going on this same way, because you still brought up, there shouldn't be an overlap. And it's interesting because you said it's got to be the water, and you said we test the water and it's much more carcinogenic than it would be. What I'm saying is you haven't tested the water. You haven't provided any evidence. Oh, well, if you'll take your screen off, I'll be able to share mine. You haven't shown any evidence that is it off? Oh,
it's paused, so you should be able to put yours up.
Oh, you have to stop.
Yeah, I just
there we go.
You take that down and put that up. Okay. I know. A lot of moving parts.
So what I'm saying is, there's extra cancer in this place. And Bill just keeps saying, it's the water, because that's the automatic assumption. What I'm saying is, no, look, because I'm testing the paint and bringing in the receipts to show it's the houses that have green paint where there's extra cancer. So we can tell everyone to stop drinking the water. But if we don't know that that's the cause, we shouldn't just keep saying there's more cancer. It has to be the water. And that's what I feel like Bill is saying without showing any evidence. So I do want to go on. I will say I was massively disappointed and unhappy with Clark's presentation of Hiram's deed, and also with Dan Vogel's answer to it. So I don't know that everyone will know what we're talking about, but I'm going to go ahead and share because I don't have time to fully explain. But let me try to get to it. So this is William Clayton's journal that people use to prove the validity of, to tie Emma's deed to polygamy and to prove the truth of William Clayton's journal, that the revelation was received this day. I go into this extensively in my first 2 episodes on deeds. I don't have time to now, but to claim that Emma's deed is what William Clayton was talking about on July 12th requires you to ignore much of this journal and to conflate the entries for the 12th, 13th, and 15th, which is what all of the historians that deal with this do. And I show many examples of it. So as I said, I don't have time to go into it now, but you need to read each of these and recognize that the deed matches many things that are recorded in the 15th. Doesn't have much at all to do with the 12th. No one besides me has even tried to define unencumbered lots. The bargain is made on the 13th. Anyway, the problems with this are massive. They're deep and they're big. As I said, I can't do it justice right now. But this deed that was recorded, there we go. There's William Clayton again. This deed that was recorded in Carthage is used to verify William Clayton's journal. The problem is William Clayton was the one who did every step of it. William Clayton wrote the journal, wrote the affidavits of the origin of polygamy, wrote both deeds, recorded the deeds. The Joseph Smith Papers claims that Emma recorded the deeds. I have refuted that, and every historian that has watched it or dealt with it agrees with me and said I made my case. So I don't have time to go into it, but just know this is all William Clayton. It's one source. They're not corroborating each other because it's just one source. But what people who've dealt with this haven't done is go do the work to go find the original deed, which we have, which is available on the Joseph Smith Papers, which is where I found it. So this is the original deed that is dated July 12th, 1843, written by William Clayton. You can see, and I go into this more as well, it's not finished. It's never signed. It's never dated. It's not even finished, as I said. The thing that is shocking is the same day. So William Clayton claimed that Joseph Smith told him to write this deed, how we interpret it now, because Emma was so upset about the revelation being read to her. And so it says, he told me to deed all the unencumbered lots to Emma. He's much troubled about Emma. So everyone interprets this as like a divorce deal, or this is because their marriage is so shaken up because of the revelation, right? That's the explanation. As I said, it ignores and conflates the entries for the following two entries in his journal. What I found was a deed written to Hiram that is nearly identical, the same date, the same amount. It includes some different plots of land in the beginning, but then includes 52 of the exact same lots that are on Emma's deed. This one is actually finished. But on the second page of it, you can see that it's crossed out and it has Emma written in instead of Hiram. So it looks to me like William Clayton, who wrote both deeds, and we're not even getting into things like the layout of this day and how all of this was supposed to happen on this day. It's just a ridiculous story if we actually look at it. But this deed on its own, I hope people are able to see that it absolutely is a death blow to the credibility of William Clayton's journal, because he gives us a reason for Emma's deed, but he never tells us that he wrote this deed. And this deed, so they used the first page of Emma's deed, the first page of Emma's deed, the second page of Hiram's deed that was switched to Emma to record it into the Nauvoo registry. He did that on his own. William Clayton wrote both of these deeds, wrote the journal entry about it, which I think he did later. I believe he did these deeds on this day. I think he wrote the journal entry later. By the way, the journals have never been released, right? We don't have any access to them. And I have to find where I put this picture because it astonishes me that all of these people that don't believe the church about much of anything. I'd have to go back too far to get to this picture, but I really want to. So let me just go back to it really fast. That any of us who just don't believe this sight unseen, that this is who we are, right? This journal has never been released, despite the fact that they promised to release it in 2017. Still no signs. The latest word is don't hold your breath. They keep telling us how much work it requires in order to release it. But William Clayton's English missionary journals from England before Nauvoo have been available for years on the BYU's digital library. Even with all of the redactions that are in them, they still contain more than enough salacious information with women for this young missionary, for any missionary today to be sent home numerous times. They're a fascinating and somewhat eye-opening read. And then also his journals after the Nauvoo period have been available on the church history catalog for many years. So it's hard to understand why the Nauvoo journals need to be kept so secret. And people don't understand even the complexities of them, like that there are different segments that are recorded. There's at different times and how they appear to be later clean copies that are manufactured after the fact. So I am not claiming that the deeds are not original and that there's any problem with the deeds. I am claiming that William Clayton's journal ought to be viewed with a lot more skepticism than it is. And it's shocking to me that people who have left the church and don't trust the church on anything just claim, if you don't believe what we have about the William Clayton journals and the narrative we make from it, you're a conspiracy theorist. That doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Thank you, Michelle. Bill?
So, Michelle, I say that there are 34 deeds between 1842, January 1st, and June 27th, 1844. Is that the number you agree to, or is there more than that to women? To women without a man as a husband listed.
I think that's such an. I am happy to accept your numbers on that, because it wasn't.
Yeah.
That's not something that I think matters as much as you think it does, because I think you're ignoring everything I'm saying.
Yeah, I know, and the audience will have to sort that out, because I don't think I can get you to see it my way, and I don't think I'm going to see it your way. So 34 deeds, and you agree. I mean, again, we'll take the 2 of Emma and the 1 with Mary Fielding Smith out. I think we end up then with 12, right? Elizabeth Davis Durfee, Patty Bartlett, Mary Elizabeth Rawlings Lightner, Helen Marr, Sylvia Sessions, Flora Ann, Sarah Scott Mulholland, the Partridge Sisters, Miranda Nancy Johnson, Sarah Ann Whitney, and maybe you added one more into it. So, and maybe you took one more out or something.
Night.
Okay, so there's at least 11, 12, 13, and you agree that those are legitimate. I don't mean legitimate as in they're trustworthy deeds necessarily. Again, I don't think you're arguing that, but that they're legitimate in the sense that there is an actual deed from the church to, or from the local Nauvoo government sort of connected to the church to those women, correct?
I don't know what you mean by from the government.
Just the
many
local
of the
Nauvoo
deeds are written. Well, they're transferred either from Joseph Smith as trustee and trust, or as from Emma and Joseph Smith together, which I think is another thing that you ignore, which matters because we have Emma participating in deeds to supposed plural wives while she's so opposed to it. So anyway, I would agree that these deeds are transferred. It's not your anyway, but I think it's interesting that you've never looked at Joseph Smith's deeds to men or to couples.
No,
or
yeah,
it's interesting that you choose these.
Yeah, I'm choosing these because it makes the point, and not because it's me finagling to find a spot to make the point. It's that there are 34 deeds that are given to women without a man listed, and a significant number of those deeds seem connected to Joseph Smith's polygamy. And you're saying it's the green paint, and I want to say one more thing, but then what I would love an answer to is for you to explain in layman terms, rubber meets the road, what happened that led to a high preponderance of deeds being given to alleged wives of Joseph Smith. In other words, if it's not Joseph Smith, why? And I don't need any one of those to be directly connected to polygamy. It's the collective group. It's way too many of them. You might be able to explain Sarah Ann Whitney. Maybe you can explain Sarah Scott Mulholland, but you have to explain them collectively. So let me say first, the water is section 101 with rumors of polygamy. The water is Fanny Elger, where we redefine scrape, but even in the time of that day, scrape would have been understood to mean something very scandalous and almost certainly sexual. The Lot Bible, the workaround for that, there's the lady in the John C. Bennett, where we come up with a doppelganger, but those are all like allowances and conjecture. The water is Joseph Smith's polygamy. Hence, when we see something else that seems deeply connected to Joseph's polygamy, it is the most reasonable conclusion, unless you can explain in like specifics how the green paint is the cause. Hence, help me understand why 12, 11, 13 of the 34 deeds appear to be connected to polygamy, but they're not, at least not in the way that I'm thinking.
Okay, so I'm going to do my best here. So first of all, I have already explained, let me just take one example, the deed to the Partridge Sisters that you count specifically as a deed proving Joseph Smith's polygamy. And I've showed several other examples of deeds that parents purchased for their children collectively. And
I just want you to steel man me. Can I stop you for just a moment? I'm not saying any one of these deeds conclusively proves Joseph Smith's polygamy. I'm saying the preponderance of all of them, even if you can explain a couple of them away, proves Joseph Smith's connection to polygamy.
So I think that that's very poor thinking, because what it looks to me like you are doing is your conclusion that you've already established is in every part of this analysis. from your selection of dates of deeds we should include to every other part of it. So I don't feel like you're able to look at it honestly. I don't think it's good enough to say, I think Joseph Smith was a polygamist. So since these deeds overlap, that proves he's a polygamist. When I'm coming to you saying, this deed has this explanation, this deed has this explanation, this deed fits within this category, I'm showing all these ways, and you keep just saying, no, because I know Joseph Smith was a polygamist, so it has to be the water. It's the water. Joseph Smith was a polygamist, so it doesn't matter how many ways you show. I've got this analogy. I've got this model set up in my mind. So maybe this would be a useful thing to do, because we can't, as we set the parameters before, we can't argue the whole question of Joseph Smith's polygamy. I just would like to know that if someone coming to look at deeds without their mind already firmly established in the idea that Joseph Smith absolutely is a polygamist and there's no wiggle room there, if they would look at the deeds and go, oh, look, deeds are evidence of Joseph Smith's polygamy, especially when you consider that every other expert who has dealt with Joseph Smith's polygamy has never used deeds as a defense, including the original holders of the deed, the original Utah Mormons, the original Utah polygamists, who were desperate. They had an existential need to prove that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. They never used deeds as any way to prove it. It was so far out that I promise you that if deeds in any way, if Joseph had given Helen Mar Kimball a deed, either to provide for her or in any way as a token of their marriage, in any way related, with everything she wrote with her, I think, great imagination, trying desperately to paint Joseph as this wonderful man, she would have said something about the deed if it was in any way related. And so let me just quickly share my screen one more time to show this is one of, I just want to keep bringing little pieces forward so people can understand other parts of this. So these are still counted as evidence of Joseph Smith's marriage to Sylvia Lyon. And you can see here we have two, these are from John Taylor's collection. He has two collections of 40 these are the earliest deeds. Earliest claims of anybody being Joseph Smith's wife, of any specific wives, come in 1869 by John Taylor. And these are the two from Sylvia Lyon. You can see they have different dates on them. One says 8th of February, 1842. One says 8th of February, 1843. None of these affidavits are in the women's own voice, in the women's own hands. Several of the signatures are forged. And you can see on Sylvia Lyon, who you'll know, for those who know, is the mother of Josephine Lyon, who was told, she signed an affidavit in 2015 saying that her mother on her deathbed told her that she was Joseph's daughter. And so these two, Sylvia Lyon never claimed to be a plural wife of Joseph Smith. And these two deeds that are, I mean, not deeds, we've been talking about deeds. These two affidavits were filled out in the same hand that filled out all of John Taylor's collection of affidavits. You can see it says, be it remembered that on this blank day of blank, Sylvia Lyon, Sylvia Lyon, who by me is sworn in this day due form of law, and upon her oath saith that on the 8th day of February, AD 1842 or 1843, in the city of Nauvoo, was married or sealed to President Joseph Smith by blank in the presence of blank. Never signed, never finished. That's all there is to it. All of these affidavits that were notarized and signed, they have edits to them after the fact that, as I said, they were all pre-filled out. So when we say things like, believe the women, let me see where I have this slide. And when we are so certain of Joseph Smith's polygamy, when we say you have to believe the women, I always want to bring this up and say, okay, right? Polygamous women could never lie to defend their beliefs, to defend their leader, to defend their kingdom, which is what we have a long history of knowing exactly what polygamy does and what these kind of cultures do to women and what they breed. I'm not calling the women liars. I'm saying they were in a culture where they were not free to act on their own volition. And so I think that we don't do the women a disservice. We don't do these polygamous women a disservice when we believe their claims that Warren Jeffs would never do any of the things that we know for a fact that he did. Oops.
Can I ask a
yeah.
question in here
Yeah.
just to try to clarify a couple things for those who may not be as familiar with this? When we talk about these deeds, we're talking about price, they're sold. Do we know who paid the money for the deeds? Does anyone claim to know who paid that price for the deeds? And the second question I have, that I guess, when I saw those lists is the young girls, the 14-year-old, I think one's 16, that they're getting land deeds as well. Are they buying those, or their parents buying their, who is funding these deeds?
I don't know that
So I
we
think
know that money exchanged hands. I think there's at least a reasonable conclusion that money in many of these cases isn't actually changing hands regardless of what's written on the deed. Do we think Emma Smith or Hiram Smith or anyone else paid $10,000 for the unencumbered lots? I don't. And we also ought to acknowledge on the front, Joseph, if he's giving out land for any personal reason, if he's selling land for any personal reason, if not every one of these deeds can be argued that these are legitimate, money was paid, these are reasonable land transfers, he's acting as trustee in trust on behalf of the church. And I think there's at least good reason to believe that he really has no right to be transferring some of this land for whatever reasons he does.
So I'll give you my perspective, Landon. So I think that I've clearly demonstrated that deeds to children were most likely purchased by their parents, right? I think that I think it's bad historical practice to just choose what evidence, what parts of the historical record we're just going to ignore simply because they don't confirm our chosen conclusion. I haven't seen Bill provide any reason to ignore. There's a variety of prices on the deeds. And again, are we just saying only deeds from Joseph Smith to women don't have a legitimate purchaser, or all of Joseph Smith's deeds, or all of the deeds trading hands from everybody in Nauvoo? Exactly which deed should we ignore the price on when it is part of the historical record? I don't think it is good historical practice to say that doesn't match my conclusion, so I'm going to say we should ignore it. I will say I covered this in my episodes. Deeds with a very round price tag, I would say $1,000 or $10,000. We do have good evidence that at least in some cases, I wouldn't say all cases, but in some cases that can be a stand-in price for something else. So I do think that I would agree with Bill in terms of deeds for $1,000. Those make me curious. Oh, I wonder what that might have been about. If it was actually $1,000 or if that was a standing price, because I have found several examples. For example, one of the deeds that Bill included at first, that is a deed from Joseph to Emma in 1842. Can't remember the exact date off the top of my head, but it might be in June of 1842. He deeded Emma a lot for $1,000. But if you go look in the Relief Society minute book, just a few days before that, Joseph promised the Relief Society that he would deed a lot to them in order to, I can't remember exactly what it was, but in order to facilitate their efforts to care for the needy, the poor and the needy, so that they could have a place to build a home or whatever they needed to do to care for people. And so we can, every one of these deeds that has a record that I'm able to look into, I have found a clear explanation for it, just like the deed to Jane Gully. So that's what I'm trying to demonstrate. Bill is so certain that it's the water, meaning it's the polygamy, that he sees a deed to Jane Gully that matches up with John Bennett's Mrs. G. So therefore it must be polygamy. She must be the missing wife. And I've clearly demonstrated that it wasn't. But I feel like Bill isn't willing to acknowledge any of that. He just keeps saying, well, there are still too many. And I didn't include Jane Gully in my analysis. There are too many. I'm saying every individual deed we are able to look at has a very clear explanation. And I have provided, I think, a much more logical explanation for any potential overlap. The people buying deeds in Nauvoo were the same pool of people that went to Utah and that claimed that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. The people in Nauvoo that had association with Joseph Smith were the women that were claimed as wives, even when they never claimed it themselves. That more than adequately explains the overlap. Not all of the people in Nauvoo were that close to the center of the church where they would be buying land, and not anyway. I think that demonstrates very clearly I think that is an explanation for the overlap, especially when every single individual deed we look at, we can explain exactly what it's about. So I think that Bill's bias is coming through quite clearly here with things like the Partridge deed, Jane Gully, a lot of other things, and being unwilling to consider that there could be another explanation for it.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bill, I shouldn't talk about you in the third person. I feel like your bias is coming through.
That's okay. I feel the same way about you. Again, doppelgangers and all the other things that sort of wipe away or
Oh,
dismiss.
I think that's unfair. That's unfair to go to that because
Oh,
that's one
well,
issue
let
that
me
we're not
hold,
talking
hold
about
on.
right now.
Hold
We
on.
can have another conversation about
Yeah,
that
let
topic.
me share why I
That's
thought
a
it was
low blow, Bill.
no,
You're better
hear me
than
out
that.
though. I'll tell you why I don't think it is. Because you keep pointing to Jane Gully and I keep eliminating her from my analysis because I self-admit that I think it's a better explanation than No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brody. Her explanation doesn't work out. And every time I've mentioned Jane Gully, what I have said is that this is a better explanation for what John C. Bennett is saying. I've eliminated it every time from my analysis, and you keep holding me accountable to it. And that doesn't make any sense. If it's not part of my data, why do I have to explain it when I self-admit I eliminate it? Because we don't have certainty that it's a plural wife of Joseph Smith. I'm essentially saying you're doing it over here, but you're not. And then you want to say I'm biased, but you're not also seeing that some of your own attempts at it do something that you're accusing me of that I'm actually not doing. I don't include Jane Gully. Now, you said the
Can I
deeds of
respond to that?
no, hold on. You've said a lot. Give me a moment. So in the deeds, you said the deeds have never been used to prove polygamy. I agree. You can't take Helen Mar Kimball's deed sitting all by itself and go, this proves Helen Mar Kimball is a plural wife of Joseph Smith. You can't take any one of these 12, 13, 14 deeds and do that. I'm not making any argument about any individual deed proving polygamy. What I'm saying is that 12 out of 34, 13 out of 34, 14 out of 34 says
11
something.
or 12. We can keep it accurate.
Sure. Well, okay. But again, we've eliminated a wife. We've added a wife in. Again, that number also isn't exact. So whatever that number
And we
is,
should actually go down to 10 because you said that you
that's
don't
fine.
hold William the
We can go
Wikipedia,
to,
so we should
we
say
can
10.
go to, yeah, for this record, we could go to 8. It's still a significantly heavy preponderance. And so I'm not arguing that any one deed proves polygamy. I'm saying that 8 out of 34 is not explainable as a coincidence. It's not explainable by going into how other deeds were done and going, well, this one falls into that category. It still significantly stands out and it's an anomaly and it deserves an explanation. And with everything surrounding Joseph Smith's polygamy, in all the points that are argued by the deniers, but which essentially all of the professional historians and scholars stand by, it seems as though the most reasonable conclusion is Joseph Smith's polygamy. And I want to say one last thing, which is let's take you. I agree with you, by the way. In high demand fundamentalist religions, there is a heavy pressure, specifically on females, to be loyal to the system. Often in patriarchies, women take on power by lifting the patriarchy up and validating it, acknowledging it, and being loyal to it. There's a thing in biblical studies, and it's in other places too, but it's in biblical studies called the criterion of embarrassment. Anytime somebody in the historical record shares a data point and says they are in, and it leads to sort of feeling embarrassed by it, it leads credibility to the data point being true. An example is that Jesus Christ was underneath John the Baptist, at least in the beginning. That John the Baptist is actually the teacher and Christ is sort of his student. And the fact that they share that, there's some embarrassment to saying the Son of God is beneath someone leads to the fact that there probably was a John the Baptist. And in Mormonism, we can see the criterion of embarrassment in effect with, say, Mary Elizabeth Rawlings Lightner. If she's making up her story, it doesn't make sense to say that Joseph Smith approached her when she's 12 years old. Even with the sensibilities of the 1900s, there's something uncomfortable about that. When Lucy Walker says she's given 24 hours to make a decision and then another 24 hours and Joseph takes her into his home and says that these are my daughters and then tries to change a parent-daughter relationship into a husband-wife intimate one, there's a lot of uncomfortability, embarrassment. If you're going to make up the story, you wouldn't be that detail-oriented, number one. Number two, you would create a story that makes Joseph Smith look better than a predator, and she doesn't. And when I read the story of Lucy Walker, what I sense is someone who's telling the truth because the truth is really kind of gross and yucky. And if you get the chance to make the story whatever you want, because Brigham has said, just come up with a story, make Joseph Smith the polygamist, you don't write in details that make your founder look like a child predator. And so I think that there are abundance of issues that support Joseph Smith's polygamy, but which folks on your side sort of dismiss. And so I would rather just set those all off to the side and say 10, 11, we could do 8. Let's say 8. 8 out of 34 deeds seem connected to Joseph Smith's polygamy, and we don't really have a great explanation. You can take each one independently and go, it kind of fits here, maybe there. There's another deed that looks sort of similar. But I think, again, we'll let the folks decide. I would be excited to see the comments. I think the deeds seem connected to polygamy, and polygamy has all of this other stuff happening. It just feels like that's the most reasonable, rational conclusion. And I still haven't heard an explanation for how collectively that preponderance is so high.
Okay, so several things to respond to. First of all, I acknowledge that you didn't include Jane Gooley in your statistical analysis. I think we should pay attention to the statistician's analysis of your analysis. I think it deserves more credit than you've been giving it, and your listeners have been giving it. But I do think you are accountable for Jane Gooley, because I hope that you're prepared to say, okay, I was wrong about Jane Gooley. She's not a wife. You say that that's a more logical explanation than Fawn Brodie. I think by far the more logical explanation is that John Bennett was making things up. And that's a whole other conversation to have, but that's the explanation that I think makes the most sense. So we don't need to look for a Mrs. G and try to connect her through deeds that are then disproven. And so I think that does play into the validity. You were so certain of your deeds and so biased by them that you assumed that this woman was a wife without doing any more investigation. I was the one that found this evidence about Jane Gooley based on your claim. And I think that I would hope you would acknowledge that and own it, that the predictive ability of your hypothesis is non-existent, as is the falsifiability of your hypothesis. I think those things matter. And so also, as to what was the other thing? I do think it's interesting that you here now have shifted to the broader question of Joseph Smith's polygamy, which can look like sort of okay, I can't argue about deeds anymore. I just have to go to, because it's so obvious that Joseph Smith is a polygamist, therefore I'm safe bringing my bias to the deeds. And again, the appeal to authority, every expert, and what I am working so hard to help people understand is that our narrative about Joseph Smith's polygamy is at least 20, 30, 40 years out of date. We have so much more evidence than we had when that historical certainty was established. And it is very slow, difficult, laborious, painstaking work to try to get people to open their mind enough to consider the new evidence and to let go of the bias enough to say, oh, maybe I shouldn't bring my certainty of Joseph Smith's polygamy through the land deeds to claim it's the most logical explanation, which I think you just acknowledged that you did by the last response that you gave. And so in terms of what was the last thing you said that I wanted to respond to? Oh, hey, someone help me out. Bill, what were the other things that you said? I was trying to make my notes, but I didn't do a very good job. I guess I'll cede the rest of my time and maybe claim it back later. But Bill, I would ask you, I have proposed, and you keep saying I haven't. And yet I have multiple times proposed what I see as a much more likely explanation of the overlap. And that's that the faithful Nauvoo saints wanting to build up Zion, therefore purchasing deeds from Joseph Smith, were among the same group, the majority of which went to Utah and became defenders of polygamy. I would like to know why you think that is not an adequate explanation of any potential overlap, especially when you consider things like one of the things that William Law, who started the Nauvoo Expositor, one of the things he was so angry at Joseph Smith about is that he wanted to be a speculator. He wanted to get wealthy off of Mormonism. So he purchased a bunch of land. And Joseph Smith, who was drowning in debt because of things like being chased out of Missouri, where he had personally purchased the property, and then having the steamboat Nauvoo sink, which was what made it so he couldn't declare bankruptcy when everybody else was. He was drowning in debt. He died in bankruptcy. And I want to show one more thing as well. Anyway, that was one of the things that William Law was so angry at him about, is that he asked the saints to please purchase land deeds from him, from the trustee and trust, from the church, so they could try to pay off these church debts that were not personal debts of Joseph Smith. He accrued these debts trying to build a city for Zion. So I know that's a whole other discussion, but I do want to bring up, let me see if I can find just one more document that I think is really interesting. So, can I get there on this other screen? Sorry, I've got too many screens open. I will get there
Too
as
much
fast
information.
as I can.
That's right.
It's just, I'm trying to do a lot of things at the same time.
While
So
you're
let me see.
looking, Michelle,
Yes.
take a moment. I just
Oh,
want
I
to know,
just
you
found
said,
it, but
you said nobody uses the deeds as evidence. I think up until a certain point, I think that's true. I will just note, Dan Vogel has found our work on these, I think I'm fair to say, convincing. I know,
I watched your discussion with him and I heard
yeah.
his response. I would love to be
Yeah,
able to
again,
converse with
you can
Dan Vogel
disagree with
about
him.
it.
I'm just noting that there's this historian / scholar in Mormonism who really does do history at a professional point of view. Whether he's right or wrong, I'm just noting that he finds it convincing. I know that Brent Metcalf finds it convincing, and I know that Don Bradley has asked for my research in order to further
Dan
it.
Bradley and
So,
I have had multiple conversations
yeah,
about it.
I just
So,
want to note that
um,
there are people now who, having seen what I've presented, are on board, and they are folks who have had a deep historical influence on analyzing the history of Mormonism. So
okay, so
yeah,
I would respond to that and say, I don't blame people for being curious when new evidence is brought forward. It's worth looking into. It's really easy. This is what I responded to when you and RFM had your first episode with Lindsay Hansen Park and Brian Buchanan. I thought it was really interesting. It's really easy to be convinced of something when you've only heard one side, right? So I think that both sides should be heard before we claim that people are finding these arguments convincing. Because I will say that people on my side have been a little impatient with me that I've even taken the time to respond to it because they find it so problematic and not convincing. But let me show this. I again will have to explain a little bit of the context for this. But this is a letter. Are you able to see this letter? I can try to go to the full screen. This is, if not the last, at least one of the last. Oh, is it still, does it show loading for you guys?
Yeah, it did show up
Hopefully it
and
will
then
come
it
up soon.
disappeared.
Okay, well, it's just, I guess my computer's doing a lot of things. Hopefully it shows up soon. If not, I'll see if I can share it again. But it is the last known letter, or one of the last known letters, from Joseph Smith to Emma Smith, written in Joseph's own hand. This was, I believe, June 23rd. So it's when he had left Nauvoo and was going somewhere else. Anyway, and it is before he came back to Nauvoo and before he was arrested. I will say this letter alone, there's so much more evidence, but it exposes the entire false claim of Brigham Young on the Joseph Smith history that he and Willard Richards and the others went on to write. And I think it also exposes William Clayton, who was part of that same group. Because if you read this, it makes it abundantly clear that neither Emma nor Joseph had an awareness, I think, of this deed that William Clayton filled out to both Hiram and to Emma, and then recorded to Emma and recorded in his journal. I will acknowledge that Emma did sell lots from this deed, starting, I believe, in 1847. So a few years later, after the courts had gotten really involved. She was removed as administratrix, I think, because of the dirty dealing of Brigham Young and others, and 2 other administrators were put in. The courts got involved, so it makes sense that she would have been informed about this about this deed that was recorded in Carthage a few years later and could start selling land. But before that, she never sold a single lot. And you can see that Joseph is trying to provide for his family. He did care about providing for his family, his one wife, and you can see in this how hard he's trying. Heber C. Kimball has $1,000 in hand of mine. And that's interesting because Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young talk about that later on in some of their Utah talks. He tells all of the other property that she can start to try to sell. You may sell the Quincy property or any property that belongs to me. You can find anything about for your support and the children and mother. And it goes on and it shows how, I think, how close their relationship is, how much he's caring. And if William Clayton's journal narrative were true and they were on the brink of divorce, so Joseph deeded all of these lots to Emma so that she would be provided for, or whatever excuse we want to know, then Emma would know all of the lots she owned and she would be able to just take care of business. This letter is, I think, a really important one to help expose the narrative that begins this all. And I will again say, like Bill, I still would like you to explain why the overlap between between the saints going to Utah, why you see that as completely implausible, and continue to say that I haven't responded to the overlap. And then also maybe you could define which deeds we should ignore the prices on, be a little more. I've explained very clearly that it's the $1,000 deeds or the $10,000 deeds that need to be at least explored and see if there's a reason for that, because that shows up. For example, that deed that Joseph Smith gave to the Relief Society had $1,000 price. So I think that there is a case to be made for those round numbers. But maybe you could explain those two things. And also, if Emma had this deed for, quote, all the unencumbered lots in Nauvoo, whatever that means, because no one else has even looked into what that means and tried to sort out what the unencumbered lots would be, why Joseph would need to try to take care of her this way.
So, in regards to the saints going west, it sounds to me, if I hear you right, Michelle, what you're saying is that the inner circle, the folks who go with Brigham Young west, is a much smaller group than the population of Nauvoo that I'm utilizing. Hence, we should expect that those deeds would be connected to, that we should find a higher number of women connected to Joseph Smith's polygamy among those deeds. Is that not? So I guess
No.
Okay, so please explain clearly, and I may just be not able to connect the dots here. What are you saying in terms of the preponderance of these deeds seems to be on some level, you're saying, connected to which people were closest to Brigham and went west? Or what are you wanting me to respond to?
Well, first, I'll come back to that. I've talked for a minute, so I'll let you have a chance. So you can answer which deeds we should ignore the price on. Is it all deeds transferred in Nauvoo, from what years, from what people, from what? Tell me that, and then I can ask this question again.
No part of the deed prices are part of my assertion. I'm only going with the preponderance of the number of deeds given to women without a man and connected to the alleged wives of Joseph Smith, and I've made no argument in this presentation about the prices of deeds having an impact on that.
Except you've said we should just ignore it because you keep saying deeds were given, or you accept
I did
transferred.
Today. Okay, I'll say transferred. I didn't make that argument today.
Well, because I think it's important to recognize the difference between purchased and given. And I know transferred is a middle ground.
Well, if folks will go back to everything I said.
Record.
Yeah, if folks will go back and use the word transferred every time I said given, I would be comfortable with that. I'm saying that the prices don't matter to me. That's not part of my argument.
But they should matter because they're part of the historical record, and they show
lots of
that
things are part of the historical record. I just disagree. The prices don't matter to my assertion.
Please let me finish my sentences.
You've talked for like 30 minutes, and I've had like 5. So there is some level of I need to get some fairness back in the time that I'm speaking and represented. I have not made any claim that the prices matter in my assertion. What matters is that we should expect to find 3.4% of 1,000 people being connected to the polygamy of Joseph Smith, and what we find instead is 30%.
You can keep going.
No, that's it. That's my point. And then I want to know, I want to understand how you are clearly explaining the 30%.
So it requires a different kind of thinking than I'm hearing you being able to get into yet. The first claims of specific wives don't come until 1869. Well into the polygamist Utah years, right?
Agreed. Yep.
In Nauvoo, there was
for the most part, there's exceptions, but for the most part, yes. I would say, for instance, Fanny Alger, for instance, is mentioned much earlier than 1869.
But not as a polygamist wife.
Right.
We could get into that history.
Sure.
It'd be fascinating to have another conversation.
Illegitimate relationships with women, which sort of always gets the cover of polygamy regardless. But I agree with you, by the way. And I don't think it's even conducive to the point you're making. We'll just to you that essentially it's 1869 or later that we all sort of have a public record of who the wife.
Yeah, Fanny Alger was never claimed to be.
Yeah.
There was some scuttlebutt that I think is misunderstood that we could get into in another conversation with Warren Cowdery. But in any case, the first time that any specific women were claimed as Joseph Smith's wives was in 1869 in response to the RLDS missionaries coming to Utah and saying that Joseph was never polygamous, which also the reason that Section 132, what became Section 132, the polygamy revelation, was pulled out of Brigham's desk, I say magically, in 1852, is because they wanted to make their claim to the U.S. government. It was kind of like my Mormon friends will have to forgive me, but the proclamation on the family, right? Was that a revelation, or was that a strategic tool needed in order to show the government we have a religious right here? That's exactly what Section 132 was. It was because immediately Orson Pratt went to Washington, D.C., was sent to Washington, D.C., and started publishing the seer to try to make his case. Look, this is part of our religious freedom. That's why they needed the document. And so anyway, the point I'm making is that this narrative that we are retroactively, this is very, I'm too flustered to think of the word I'm looking for when we are applying our mind of our thinking to the past. But that's what we're doing in this. So in Nauvoo, people were coming to Nauvoo. Joseph Smith asked the people to please buy deeds from the church, from him, so that they could pay off these debts, right? So people were purchasing lots because they were building the city of Nauvoo, the kingdom of God, as they saw it. And then, so let's wash polygamy away, because we need to go through every single deed from everyone in Nauvoo, to men, to women. It's irrelevant, the deeds to women, if you're making these larger analyses of what Joseph Smith was doing with deeds. So the deeds in Nauvoo were purchased for the most part by people who were invested in building up the kingdom of God. And then we know that the majority of the people in Nauvoo felt like Brigham Young made the best case in that, what was it, August 1845 or 45 speech, when Sidney Rigdon didn't do as well. So the majority of people who were desperate for a leader because their beloved leader had fallen, who had no idea about polygamy, chose to follow Brigham Young west, where polygamy was later introduced and where arguments of polygamy were introduced much later after that. And they needed to be able to say who were the possible wives, right? So there's an overlap in the people who would have been purchasing land in Nauvoo and the people who would have been in Utah, or whose names would have been in Utah. Because, for example, Sarah and Mariah Lawrence, I don't know if it's Maria or Mariah, were both claimed as wives. Mariah was dead, and Sarah actually comes to Salt Lake City to say that she was never married to Joseph Smith, and to stop saying that. But she's disregarded, and we still include her as a wife. These are the kinds of things. This has been such a one-sided claim for so long that there's a lot of information that people need to consider in order to just open their minds enough to go, oh, maybe there is a really good discussion to be had here. So maybe I shouldn't bring this certain bias I have to the land deeds and say preponderance. Well, it's not even a preponderance. There is an overlap. Therefore, it must be polygamy.
So you're saying that the women in Utah who
it's not necessarily about the women.
Yeah, well,
I don't think it was the women that
I'm not sure if you know what I'm
made the
going to
arguments.
ask.
Okay. You keep going to the women, and I'm just saying the people making the arguments weren't just the women, or even mainly the women.
I'm not, that's not where I'm going. So the women in Utah who Brigham pinpointed to carry on the story that they were the wives of Joseph Smith, you're saying that they naturally would show up more often in the land deeds because they're the same families and people who were influential in the church in Nauvoo in 1843. They're the kind of families that could have had money to purchase land. They're influential. They go west with Brigham. And of course, these would be the same overlapping families that would be selected to be pinpointed as having been polygamous with Joseph Smith, even though they weren't.
Kind of. I'm not saying anything about the special families, but I also want to clarify, it's not that Brigham was pinpointing these women, asking them to make the claims. Joseph F. Smith is the one who compiled affidavits it was the Relief Society presidency often who was going to the women and asking them to write their stories. That's what happened with Helen Mar Kimball and with many of the others. They, Elizabeth, oh goodness. Oh, I'll think of her name. But anyway, they were asked to write their stories by, it wasn't Brigham Young orchestrating all of this. Brigham Young was the one in charge and setting the new narrative, but the people there were many people invested in it.
It seems to me that it would be a really difficult thing for them to sort of know. And again, I'm not saying you're asserting this, but it would be a really difficult thing for them to know, hey, remember those deeds we gave out, the church gave out back in 1842, 1843, 1844. We could pick those ladies. And I guess I'm still trying to figure out why we find 30% of the deeds made up of by 3.4% of the population or less.
Because I think your question about 3.4% of the population is mistaken.
Can you help me demonstrate how that's mistaken? Because can you show that the number of available females would be greater than 1,000? Because it has to be actually, it would have to be lower than 1,000.
Smaller.
Yeah. And so you'd have to demonstrate that less than 1,000 available females were in Nauvoo, or that number even becomes more problematic.
Many of the people that came to Nauvoo, from what I understand, wouldn't even have met Joseph Smith. As you said, people were coming in. We don't know exactly, even
wouldn't the same number of people buying deeds not necessarily know Joseph Smith to the same degree? I mean, a family moves in, and what families buy deeds and which families don't, wouldn't that also be just as random?
I don't think so, because people that were buying deeds probably, I would think that you would, if you're buying a deed from Joseph Smith, you had an interaction with Joseph Smith. And we can look at things like the Partridge sisters, right? And their father purchased a deed. We know it would be an interesting analysis, and I haven't done this.
I think you could do it. You could look at the men. Yeah, if you looked at the men,
that was what I was
and there was
a
less percentage chance of them being related to Joseph Smith's alleged polygamy, then you would have your answer. If the number of men is much more random, then you would assume that the women would be sort of that same randomness. And I think you could get at this data. And if we found that the men were much more random, meanwhile 30% of 3.4% of the population makes up the deeds with the women, then you'd still have to come back to trying to explain that. So maybe we can, and I don't really have anything else to say about this topic. I'm happy to sort of just finish. But maybe that's the next step, is to just grab 100 random men getting deeds and see what we find there. And if they're not as connected to polygamy, if it falls much more close to that 3.4, then these female deeds stand out as needing a better explanation. And I would be very intrigued at what that is. Again, maybe the men is just as connected, but let's just say it isn't for a minute, hypothetically. Do you have an explanation if the women really are, if there really is a preponderance of being connected to polygamy in the way that men's deeds are not? Do you have an explanation that would account for why 3.4% of the population makes up 30%?
I'm still troubled by the fact you keep saying, I don't care about one deed. You can throw out one deed. You can throw out one deed, but then you keep going to your same number, and then you say, well, it doesn't matter because my hypothesis is not falsifiable. It's going to win no matter what, because there's always a preponderance. So if we would agree to things like, okay, do you still want to include the Partridge sisters in your assessment of deeds, when we know that the deed was to all of the children, which included Edward, their brother?
No, we can throw that out. We'll throw that one out.
And so, okay, can we throw out, well, I also want to bring up the polyandry. There are a couple of other things like the polyandry. No woman ever claimed. Oh, I remembered the other thing I wanted to respond to too. So let me just say a couple of things. I'll try to be quick. No woman ever claimed that she was married to Joseph Smith and somebody else. That came simply from, they signed these affidavits they were given, and then later historians went back and found, they were already married. Just like with Jane Foley, if she had been a wife, we used John Bennett's claim, but then I showed she already had 3 children with her husband, right? So the other, hey, my brain, now I lost it again, the thing I had wanted to say.
We all have a brain freeze today. I understand.
Oh, darn it. It was really important. I remembered it twice. Shoot, I should have said it first, because it's going to drive me so bad afterwards.
If the women are an anomaly and the men are much more random, the men are 5% instead of 30. Again, we can take off the Partridge Sisters. You can take off another 1 or 2 if you want to. If there is a preponderance of female deeds being uniquely, seemingly some connection to the plural wives of Joseph Smith at a much higher rate than the men deeds, do you have an explanation for that?
Well, I don't right now. I think it would be good to do I think that if we went through all of Joseph Smith's deeds, all of the Nauvoo deeds, and tried to understand any specifics that we would need to, like the deeds to children, right? And then we did an analysis to see how much connection there was to polygamy. I would think it would need to be an analysis that was looked at by both sides, because
Sure, both sides will have ideas, the other
bias.
side doesn't. Sure.
Right. And
Yeah.
different ways. I think that would be a very fascinating exercise. My guess would be is that if we treat it fairly, it would be a pretty similar overlap. That's my guess. If it wasn't, then of course I would come to it and go, okay, what's going on here? And I would come to it with an open mind. Would you do the same? Would you say, if it is an overlap, would you let go of the deeds claim?
If I took 100 random men's deeds,
I don't think it should be 100 random men's deeds. I think it should be all of Joseph's deeds, because it's a closed set. We know exactly what there is.
sure, but at least grabbing 100 would sort of indicate what the larger sample is going to say. And I'm okay saying that, hey, this is just a sample size. But if we took 100 men's deeds and it was 5% were connected to polygamy, that would be just barely above the 3.4, and it would seem like that could be explained reasonably. If I found that it was 20%, 25%, 30%, then I would come back to the conversation and go, I don't know that we can explain all of this the way I thought we could. Yeah, totally.
Okay. So I think that would be an interesting exercise for somebody to do. And I think that, as I said, I think because there is so much variability in these deeds, people from both sides would need to look at it, I think.
Yeah. If the men are able to buy deeds just being random citizens of Nauvoo and members of the church, then it would seem as though something strange is going on with the female deeds. And you would agree with that.
Created a research project, right?
Yeah.
This is amazing.
And
you would agree with that, right, Michelle? You would agree that then becomes an anomaly that sort of runs counter to what your side's perspective is.
Well,
if the
I think
women
that
are
we would
different
need
than the
to.
men's.
Yes, but
Yeah.
with the like I don't know how, I haven't thought through how the analysis would be done.
Totally.
With
Me
the
either.
understanding of things like dowries and deeds to girls that aren't to boys, and you know what I mean. I think there would be a lot of questions that might come up in this process. But yeah, I would expect, based on my explanation of the overlap, I would expect it to be reflected,
Yeah, in
both
the
with
men's.
deeds to men and deeds to women.
Okay, then maybe I'll take on a little project over the next couple.
No, this is amazing. You heard it here, everybody, on Mormonish. New project. This is something I haven't heard of before, and really, really interesting. The possibility of what we might find. Wow. What do you think, Landon?
Yeah, I agree. One of the things, no matter what we agree on deeds or not, it seems like there's a problem one way or the other, because on one side we've got either Joseph Smith is not telling the truth about the deeds, and the other side is Brigham Young is not telling the truth about the deeds, which both of those seem to be problematic to me.
Well, are you saying about the deeds or just about polygamy? Because I don't think Brigham Young or Joseph Smith ever said much of anything about the deeds.
Well, by say, I mean, by the arguments that are being made here. One is saying that Brigham Young and the church in Utah manipulated the polygamy debate and the deeds, whereas Bill is saying that the deeds were used by Joseph to kind of conceal or to reward the polygamy. So either way, there seems to be a problem either way, and I think that's
topic.
a deep topic. But we wanted to close out with just each of you giving kind of a closing statement. And since you started originally, Michelle, would you like to give the first closing statement, and then we'll let Bill close out?
Well, I think I actually would like to try to think of what it was that I was going to respond to. So, and I think we probably
was it Lucy Walker's criterion of embarrassment? Was it the Lucy Walker story?
It was.
Yeah.
How did you remember? Okay, thank you. So, I don't know. Is it best if I go first, or is it best if Bill goes
Bill went first at the beginning, so go ahead. Let's let Michelle go. Just kind of a closing, wrap it up. And again, we recognize this is such a huge topic, it really can't be covered in, I even think 24 hours, but we've tried to, navigate some of it. There's much more research and study to be done from any of our viewers or listeners that are interested in this. So, but yes, Michelle, if you just want to kind of, give a little statement at the end, then we'll let Bill do it. And then we'll tell our viewers and listeners to go get busy and study.
So I didn't prepare a closing statement, so I'll just speak off the cuff for a few minutes.
Totally.
But I appreciate, Bill, for letting me know the embarrassment criterion. Is that the term? Did I use it right?
Criterion of embarrassment, but it might be called something else a little bit different. But yes.
Okay, so I think that's actually with much of this discussion, I think there's a lot of assumptions being made that I don't think stack up. In Utah, the way to have glory and honor and comfort and security was to claim association with Joseph Smith. In Utah, one of the biggest ways that a woman could show her faithfulness was by her sacrifice, specifically for polygamy. That comes across all the time in these speeches from Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and Jedediah Grant before that, and Wilford Woodruff, so many of these leaders. The women knew that the bigger their sacrifice was for the kingdom and specifically for polygamy, the more lauded they would be. So the women that were writing these stories about Joseph Smith were coming from a mindset of, how can I glorify the sacrifice I've made? Like Helen Mar Kimball with her mother, knowing that she was going basically like a lamb to the slaughter. It's this huge sacrifice of faith for the sake of polygamy. I think that's the proper context to read the stories that the women were writing. They were by no means trying to paint Joseph Smith as a manipulator or a pedophile. They were trying to glorify Joseph Smith while also magnifying the sacrifice that they made. There was no embarrassment about being it was much more important to be claimed to be a wife of Joseph Smith. So I think it's a mistake to just apply our vague ideas of morality to Utah culture without being much more specific and much more informed about it. But then going on, there are so many things I could say. Joseph Smith's now, you guys know I didn't come to this and I don't stay at this out of a need to defend Joseph Smith. So many people want to apply false assumptions to all polygamy deniers. And maybe it's true for some, but I think that we should just look at the evidence rather than telling people what their motivations are or using all of these logical fallacies like appeal to authority and all of these other things. Let's look at the information. Here are just some of the facts that I'll rattle off the best I can off the top of my head. Every single thing that Joseph Smith ever said, wrote, revealed, wrote in scripture, universally completely rejects, denies, forbids any form of polygamy. So I know that the Mormons look at that and call it, I'm sorry, I still use that term, call it carefully worded denials. Anti-Mormons look at it and just say, he was a liar. He was a liar, right? So I think that we need to look at the full spectrum of the evidence. Most people don't have any clue of the huge catalog of things that Joseph Smith said and did about polygamy and how he always decried it from the beginning to the end of his life. Not only denied it, but also made cases against it and tried to, if he was a polygamist, he made his job way harder than it would need to be. It's better to look at Brigham Young in the pre-1852 years to see what his discourse was like, to get an idea of how a secret polygamist would talk to the people. Brigham Young you can see grooming in his talks, grooming the people into this, which Joseph Smith did the exact opposite. Joseph Smith took constant actions trying to rid the church of polygamy. As I said, we can show the catalog. We can show the development of polygamy among these few people. And people say this would have to be such a huge, massive conspiracy. No, it wouldn't. It's a much bigger conspiracy to say that Joseph was a polygamist and trying to keep it secret. And we can go down the line showing, I am dealing with every single one of the topics, the High Council meeting, the Nauvoo Expositor, again and again. There are not motivated reasoning. There are very good discussions and conversations to be had, and a lot of evidence that people just are not aware of. And a lot of it is the fact that we are dealing with people who were actively forging the record. We have so many forged documents and erased documents, and you can see how they were actively trying to create a huge amount of false documentation of Joseph Smith's polygamy. So that's something we need to sort through and overcome. I acknowledge that it's there, but I think we need to do a much more reasonable job, a much more effective job of looking at it critically. Then we look at things like all of the letters we have between Joseph and Emma Smith, everything that everybody ever said about Emma Smith. The fact that Emma was pregnant with Joseph's child when Joseph was killed. Joseph died in bankruptcy court. Emma, she gave multiple testimony repeated testimony throughout her life that is always completely consistent, including on her deathbed, saying that this never happened. Her son, who was nearly 12 at the time that his father was killed, said that it never happened. Show me any polygamist man who doesn't teach his son, who was slated to take over the church, the highest, holiest doctrine of the church, if that was his belief. Then we look at the fact that there are no children. And I've done extensive research into any possible explanation for that, any sort of contraception or abortion. People like to just say, well, anyway, people can watch my episodes, saying that there was no advancement in contraception between the 1830s and 40s to the 1930s is like saying there was no advancement in electricity or automobile. Like there was huge advancement in every one of those areas. That has not been effectively explained, even addressed well. And we could go on and on and on. So my experience coming to this and getting into it, I was very hesitant to step into this because now I'm the laughingstock, right? People, I am hated by all sides. So I didn't come to this easily or because I wanted to. I came to it because the evidence convinced me. The body of evidence showing that Joseph Smith is a polygamist continually falls apart on closer examination, whereas all of the hard evidence, the letters between Joseph Smith, any possible children, the everything again that Joseph said, did, wrote, all of that is undeniable. And so even when they didn't know that we were going to come up with DNA evidence when they were trying to claim that Josephine Lyon was a child, for example. So I would expect it to go the other direction. As we get more information, as the Joseph Smith papers come online, as the DNA evidence becomes available, I would expect us to get closer and closer to the truth. So they should make the case of Joseph Smith polygamy stronger and stronger. Instead, the exact opposite has happened. The more information we get, the weaker the arguments for Joseph Smith's polygamy becomes. And I think that's something we should pay attention to. And I just hope that people will consider what their own bias might be. Instead of just pointing at my bias and declaring it, consider what their bias might be and maybe be willing to look at some of this with fresh eyes. And I think that just in general makes the world a better place.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah. Bill, go ahead.
First off, I want to say thank you, Michelle. I think you've put so much time and energy into this. I want to try to make sure I word this right. I don't come down on the conclusion that you do. I don't see the evidence the way you do. But I can't help but appreciate the time spent in research that you've done, the effort to try to make sense of all of this. I also want to just do a hat tip to Clark Abood as well, who, when I first took on him wanting to sit down with me, I sort of had a hunch of what kind of things would be shared. And what he presented was by far way more in breadth and scope than I anticipated. I think Dan Vogel did a nice job. I think some of the things Clark said were interesting and caused me pause. I think some of the things he said were easily knocked down by Dan Vogel. And I think that's part of how this process works is we keep throwing out things on both sides. We keep holding those things accountable and we keep trying to do better and better research. What I'm trying to say is that for folks who are dismissive of one side or the other, I would suggest not doing that. And I hope that through the conversation with Clark and with you today, folks can see that I take the conversation serious. I don't conclude the way you do. I don't conclude the way Brian Hales does on lots of things. You talk about biases, and I would simply want to tell the audience this. Often, we are all influenced by confirmation bias, meaning whatever beliefs we have and want to maintain, we are often limited in being able to change our mind if the things we currently believe are going to affect us. Emotions, they're going to affect our stance on the truth claims of the church. They're going to affect our stance on the truth claims of Joseph Smith, or maybe just the truth of Mormonism generally. whether Joseph Smith is the originator of polygamy or not, my faith in Mormonism generally, or in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, could never be restored based on all the other things that I'm well aware of. And so I think the folks who come to this conversation with the most balance are the folks who wouldn't have to change anything about how their life would be lived based on the conclusion they make. And I would put, again, I've made mistakes in this conversation. I think some of the assertions you make are also sort of flawed. We're both going to think that about each other. I would simply note that the folks I would trust the most are the professional historians. The folks I would trust the most are the professional scholars. And I would also be the least trusting, not that anyone's doing it intentionally or there's no maliciousness, but I would want to steer clear of folks who deeply need their conclusions to remain the same. And I think there's evidence on both sides. I think that it's good for people to take this issue seriously and investigate it. But I think it's a really hard task to set your current beliefs aside. Everyone, I'm not talking to you, Michelle. I'm talking to me and you and everyone, to set our beliefs aside and really tackle the evidence as it is and be open to what on the front end looks like something that gives deep credibility to one point of view, and then let the other side speak without you needing that point to maintain the way you have it, and allow it to change if the evidence coming from the other side deems that to be the case. In the end, it's up to every person to make a decision about what they believe. I think some folks need Joseph Smith to come out clean, and I think other folks need Joseph Smith to come out dirty on this issue. And I think that sort of bias is what gets in the way. I think the best bet to get at the truth is to say, let it come what it may. It might be uncomfortable, but no matter what, I want the truth at all cost. And I just want to say, again, you've put 1,000 times more time into this issue than I have. And I don't think people should take this issue lightly at all. So thank you.
Yep,
Thank you,
100%.
Bill. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
100%. Wow, this has been amazing. Landon, how do you feel?
Yeah, this has been a very interesting argument. I will say I agree with Michelle in that a lot of documents have been changed in the church that we've all seen. I think a lot of us have seen that. I also agree with Bill that most of the historians would come down on the side that the polygamy is, in fact, was practiced by Joseph Smith. I'm one of those in the camp that it had nothing to do with why I left the church, whether Joseph's a polygamist or not. There are so many other issues that were greater issues to me. So I'm interested by this. I'm interested to see how it comes out. So, but I appreciate both of you coming on and having this discussion.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad it finally happened. We've been trying to put this together for a while. It's hard with all the schedules and figuring out exactly what we would talk about and how it would go. But I think it exceeded my expectation. Let's say that on just the content and just everything that we shared. I thought it was wonderful. So please, everybody, leave your comments. Let us know what you thought. This is a much bigger picture. Again, I will encourage you to watch Michelle's content. There's so much, and it's so well done. Bill's content, he just had that series of interviews that he discussed, or episodes that he discussed. Just really interesting. If you think you understand this topic, I will say you don't. There's a lot more to it. I think that's the takeaway. You do not. And so it really is valuable to dig in, to follow everybody's content and see what else is happening. So please comment and let us know what your interaction with either of our guests or just the content has been, and keep an open mind, I think, about everything. Please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware when new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell and it'll let you know when an episode drops. If you would like to help financially support Mormonish Podcast, and we so appreciate those of you that do, we just barely became a 501c3. Yay. We worked on it a long time. There's a lot of red tape. I think I sent a couple texts to you, Bill, going, what is happening? How do you do this? So we learn from others, and everyone is so helpful to help us. But we do now have a wonderful new link to Donor Box. So very easy and convenient if anybody would like to support the podcast in that way. We really appreciate you. We also have our Mormonish merch store where you can grab I don't know, a Mormonish mug, or Landon, do you have yours, or did you?
Got mine, yep.
He's got yours. There it is. Got to
Okay,
hold
so-
that up. I learned that from Steve Pinecker, that you have to hold up your merch. That's how it works. So anyway, that's the fun link in our show notes. And again, we'll just thank so much, Bill, and thank you so much for your time. It's been.
I
Is
think
that
that's
your
Bill's
dog?
famous dog.
There's another edit.
You don't have to edit that, because think about the newscast. We have my growling Alice. We have Landon's Addie, who's often, pets are what it's all about. It makes us all show our humanity, right? So anyway, thanks you guys. And you know what? Maybe we'll do a round 2 someday, but this has been fascinating, amazing, and you guys are wonderful. So thank you, everybody. Bye for now from Mormonish. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.